Hi there, night wanderer. Yes, you wrapped up in a blanket somewhere, screen glowing soft against the dark. Thank you for choosing this quiet hour with me out of every single thing you could be doing right now. Before we start, do one small thing for me. Take a slow breath in and let it fall back out. Good. Tonight's story is a strange one, maybe one of the strangest we've sat with together. It is about bones, about blood, and about a truth your old biology teacher almost certainly never mentioned, mostly because science had not found it yet. Not fully, not until this year. Somewhere in Cambridge, Massachusetts, there is a piece of human bone smaller than a grain of rice. It came from behind someone's ear, a person who died 9,000 years ago. Scientists sealed it inside a small plastic vial, labelled it, and placed it under a microscope. And when they finally cracked open its secrets this year, they found something that quietly broke one of the biggest assumptions we ever made about ourselves. Human evolution never stopped. It might be happening again, right now, inside you. Now, before we step into that laboratory together, let's take care of a little bit of housekeeping, the soft kind. If stories like this one have slowly become part of your nightly routine, this is a good moment to tap that subscribe button and maybe leave this video a like on your way in, not on your way out, so more tired, curious people can find their way to these quiet nights too. And if a certain line tonight catches you off guard or makes you feel something you didn't expect, drop it in the comments below. I go through every single one always without fail. Tell me where you are tonight, what city, what country, what strange quiet hour it happens to be, where you're curled up right now. I love picturing all of you scattered across so many different time zones, listening to the very same story at completely different moments of your day. All right, settle in a little more, dim the lights if you can manage it. Maybe click on a fan or crack a window just enough to let in that soft, steady hum in the background. Pull something warm over your shoulders, and when you are ready, let's go meet a person who has been gone for 9,000 years and who is somehow tonight about to teach us something about what it means to be alive. Picture Anatolia in what we now call Turkey roughly 9,000 years ago. There is no name for this person in any record because writing has not been invented yet, not for a few thousand more years. So let's just call her the farmer. She wakes before the sun, does the way most people in her village do. Her home is mud brick, one of dozens pressed close together roofs used as streets, a thin line of smoke rising through a small opening cut into the ceiling. Somewhere nearby a goat calls out. A child laughs at something we will never know the answer to. She has never tasted bread from a store, never once worried about a message left unanswered. Her entire world fits inside a single valley grain goat's mud brick, and the handful of people she shares walls with for better or worse for her whole life. Her hands are rough, cracked at the knuckles, stronger than most hands you will ever shake. Before she starts her work, she pauses for just a moment at the doorway, looking up at a sky with no city lights to compete with thousands of stars scattered clean across the dark, the same stars more or less that you might glance up at tonight if you stepped outside right now. She has no idea what a star actually is. She simply finds it beautiful in a tired, quiet, early morning kind of way, and that feeling alone connects her to you more than almost anything else in this story. She grinds wheat by hand over and over, the same motion her mother once made and her mother's mother before that. She kneels beside a small fire that never quite warms her fingers, all the way through, not on the coldest mornings. Her diet day after day is almost entirely grain, now a sharp change from the wild, varied meals her ancestors once hunted and gathered across open land. Her body is adjusting to that change in ways she will never consciously notice, the same way you never consciously notice your own heartbeat. And somewhere deep inside her, quietly, without her ever knowing it, without anyone on earth knowing it, Yet her deoxyribonucleic acid is running a kind of experiment, a slow one that will not show its results for 9,000 years. She dies the way most people did back then, younger than any of us would consider, fair worn down by a life that gave very little back. Her community buries her with real care, curled gently on her side, facing east, the same direction her people always faced their dead, toward a sunrise none of them will see her greet. And then, silence. Centuries of it stacked one on top of another like pages in a book nobody is reading yet. Above her resting place, the world keeps moving almost violently fast by comparison. Cities rise where there was only dust. Empires bloom, spread and quietly collapse. Somewhere far above her, humans invent writing, then bronze, then the wheel, then something as strange as printed books, then engines, then electricity, then eventually satellites circling silently overhead, and small glowing screens not unlike the one lighting your face right now. A war ends. Another one begins somewhere else entirely. A man plants a flag on the moon while underground nothing at all changes for her. Through every single one of those centuries she stays exactly where she was placed, patient in a way none of us could ever manage, holding on to her one quiet secret. Fast forward now all the way to the spring of this year. A small team of archaeologists working carefully under a bright ordinary sun lifts a fragment of her skull out of the dry earth. Not the whole skull, just one small dense bone tucked behind the ear canal called the petrous bone. Scientists have grown to love this particular little bone for one strange, almost poetic reason. It happens to be one of the hardest, densest bones in the entire human body, which means it protects deoxyribonucleic acid far longer, far better than almost anywhere else we've ever looked. It is in a very real sense nature's own tiny vault built centuries before anyone knew there was anything worth locking away inside it. That fragment gets carefully packed, labelled and shipped across an entire ocean, all the way to a laboratory at Harvard University, where a geneticist named David Reich, along with his colleague Ali Akbari, are running one of the most ambitious projects their field has ever attempted. They're not studying one skeleton tucked quietly in a drawer somewhere. They're studying almost 16,000 of them gathered from burial sites scattered across Europe and the Middle East, some freshly uncovered from the ground, some sitting patiently in museum storage for decades, simply waiting for the right technology and the right question to finally catch up to them. Here is where the story turns almost cinematic, and I mean that quite literally. Inside this laboratory, robotic arms handle most of the bone fragments. Now ones once handled only by careful gloved human fingers. They drill out powder so fine it looks almost like flour, then wash it. Sort it slowly, turn ancient bone into a long readable code letter by letter. Rows of quiet machines hum steadily through the night, taking in strands of genetic information most of us will never see with our own eyes in a building most of us will never walk into. This particular project did not happen alone either. Behind those 16,000 samples stand hundreds of archaeologists working across dozens of countries, each one trusting a small piece of someone's ancient life to a laboratory they may never even visit. Part science, part detective story. And honestly, if you ask the people doing the work, part small miracle that any of this fragile ancient material survived at all. And what they found, published earlier this year in the respected scientific journal Nature, is the entire reason we're sitting here together tonight, lights dimmed, fan humming somewhere behind you. For decades, scientists firmly believed there were only around 20 places in the whole human genetic code where they could confidently prove that natural selection had recently actively shaped us. 20 places, out of billions of individual letters. This new study built from close to 16,000 ancient lives, just like the farmers raised that number to 479. Let that number settle for just a second. 479 separate places across our deoxyribonucleic acid, quietly rising, falling, shifting shape, all within roughly the last 10,000 years. Some of those changes touch the food we can safely eat. Some touch how well our bodies fight off illness and infection. A few, and we will get to these soon enough, even touch the colour of our skin, the colour of our hair, the shape of our faces. Evolution, it turns out, never clocked out early. It just got quieter and a great deal harder to see until someone finally figured out how to study bones the way you might study an old faded diary left behind in an attic. I will be honest with you sitting here tonight. When I first came across this discovery, I laughed a little in the good way, because somewhere in a classroom decades ago, a very confident teacher probably stood in front of a room full of restless kids and explained that evolution had basically finished its work on human beings a long time back, shut the laptop, so to speak, and went home for good mission complete. Turns out evolution never actually left the building. It has simply been working the night shift this entire time, quietly rewriting us one small generation after another, while the rest of us were far too busy inventing smartphones and worrying about deadlines to notice. So here is the quiet, almost unsettling truth sitting at the very centre of tonight's story. That farmer in Anatolia was never just some distant stranger sealed away neatly in the past, safely separate from you. She was in a very real sense one small data point inside a much larger experiment, one that is still running today. An experiment you happen to be a living result of. Your body right now, sitting there in the dark, fan humming softly, lights turned as low as you can manage, carries the fingerprints of thousands of years of small, quiet, biological decisions made long before anyone alive today was ever born. Think about that for just a moment. Somewhere in your own body tonight, a version of the very same slow, patient process that shaped her is still quietly at work in you, in your children, if you have them, in whoever you love most in this world. Not the dramatic kind of change we usually picture, no extra limbs, no glowing eyes, nothing from a science fiction film. Just small, patient, almost invisible adjustments, made one generation at a time, so slow that no single lifetime could ever notice them happening. You're not the finished version of a human being. None of us are. We're simply a very recent draft. And whether you feel it happening or not, that same slow experiment is still writing new lines tonight somewhere inside you, in this very moment, while you lie there listening. But to understand how something this enormous managed to stay hidden in plain sight for so long, we need to step back a little further than 9,000 years. We need to travel back to a single deeply confident idea, one that convinced almost the entire scientific world for most of the last century that human evolution had already reached its very last page, shut the book, and set it quietly back on the shelf. That idea did not come from a fringe thinker or someone shouting into a void nobody trusted. It came from the middle of the room. Picture a lecture hall in London packed shoulder to shoulder, students leaning against the back wall, because every seat had already gone coat still on notebooks balanced on knees. Standing at the front is a well-respected geneticist from University College London, a man named Steve Jones, someone who had spent decades studying genetics for a living, someone whose name already sat on the spine of more than one respected textbook. And in front of that crowded room more than once across more than one decade, he said something that would have sounded shocking coming from almost anyone else. Human evolution, he argued, was essentially finished, not slowing down politely. Finished. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a room when a genuine expert says something that large. Not confusion exactly, more a kind of quiet recalculation. Dozens of people rearranging what they thought they understood about their own species, all at once, all in the same few seconds. Can I ask you something before we go further into this? Did you ever hear a version of that claim growing up, maybe from a teacher, maybe from a magazine article? The idea that modern life had somehow taken humans out of the evolutionary game entirely? If so, you were not imagining it. That was not some strange rumour floating around the internet. For a long stretch of recent history, this was closer to mainstream scientific opinion than most people realise today. His reasoning, to be fair to him, was not lazy. It rested on 3 separate legs, and every one of them sounded on the surface completely reasonable. The first leg was survival itself. Go back far enough and roughly half of all children born into the world never made it to their 20th birthday. Disease, hunger, accidents, all of it working quietly to decide generation after generation who lived long enough to have children of their own and who did not. That brutal sorting process is, in the coldest possible sense, exactly what natural selection has always been. But by the early 2000s in wealthier parts of the world, something like 98 out of every 100 children were surviving into adulthood. Jones looked at that number and drew a fairly obvious conclusion. If almost everyone survives now, he asked what exactly is left for natural selection to select against. The second leg of his argument involved fathers, specifically older fathers. New mutations, the raw material evolution has always depended on, tend to show up more often in the sperm of older men. Father a child at 40 rather than 20, and you are statistically more likely to pass along a fresh genetic change. Jones pointed out that society had shifted heavily toward men fathering children earlier and towards smaller families overall, which meant in his eyes less raw mutation entering the population with each new generation. Fewer new variants, he reasoned, fewer chances for evolution to have anything fresh to work with. And the third leg was travel migration, an increasingly connected planet. For most of human history, small isolated communities evolved their own local quirks, somewhat separately from one another, cut off by oceans, mountains, deserts, or simply distance. Jones argued that as the modern world blended together, as people met, married, and had children across communities that once barely interacted, that isolation was dissolving fast. Without isolated groups drifting apart genetically, he suggested there was less room for new traits to take hold anywhere. Survival secured, mutation slowing, isolation disappearing. Stack all 3 together, and you get a strangely comforting bedtime story of our own one-grown adults. We're telling each other in university lecture halls. The story goes like this. We built hospitals and hunger stopped deciding who lived. We built a connected world and isolation stopped shaping who we became. We as a species had essentially crossed the finish line. There is a strange little contradiction folded inside that third leg one I only noticed myself after sitting with this story for a while. Populations blending together, marrying across old boundaries, having children across communities that once rarely mixed, is not actually the absence of genetic change. It is genetic change happening on a truly massive scale, all at once across the entire species. Calling that the end of evolution is a little like watching a river change course dramatically and calling it the end of rivers. The water is still moving, it is simply moving somewhere new. I understand the appeal of that story, honestly. There is something deeply satisfying about believing you are the final draft, not a rough one still being edited. It flatters us in a way few scientific ideas manage to. It suggests that everything painful earlier generations endured, the plagues, the famines, the brutal centuries of just trying to survive long enough to raise a child, all of that finally added up to something finished, something whole, something safe to stop worrying about. Who would not want to believe that? But here is where I think the argument quietly falls apart, and where it fell apart for plenty of working scientists at the time too, even if their voices did not fill lecture halls quite as loudly. Surviving to adulthood was never the only thing that decided whose genes moved forward. It was never even the main thing if we are being precise about it. Whether someone has 1 child or 6, whether they find a partner easily or struggle to, whether a pregnancy carries safely to term or quietly does not, every one of those outcomes still shapes the next generation with or without famine, with or without plague standing over anyone's shoulder. Evolution never needed a battlefield to keep doing its work. A crowded dinner table was always more than enough. Think of it this way for a moment. 2 people can both survive comfortably into old age, both healthy, both financially secure, both never once threatened by hunger or disease, and yet one of them raises 4 children who each go on to have children of their own, while the other raises none at all. Nothing about famine or plague decided that difference. Fertility did quietly and visibly completely outside the story Jones was telling. Multiply that single quiet difference across millions of people, across dozens of generations, and you get exactly the kind of steady, patient genetic reshuffling that a focus on childhood death alone would never catch. And here is a comparison worth sitting with for a moment because I find it almost funny in hindsight. While serious respected scientists stood at podiums explaining that human evolution had effectively stopped other scientists down the hall, in the very same building sometimes were watching evolution happen in real time right in front of them, just not in humans. Bacteria in a laboratory dish exposed to a new antibiotic could develop resistance to it within days, sometimes hours. Farmers battling insects that kept eating their crops watched entire populations of those insects become immune to pesticides within a handful of growing seasons. Doctors treating stubborn infections in hospitals began encountering bacteria that no longer responded to medicine that had worked perfectly well only a decade earlier. And every single autumn virus researchers had to design a brand new flu vaccine not because they enjoyed the paperwork, but because influenza mutates fast enough to slip past the previous year's defenses almost every single time. Evolution, everywhere we actually bothered to look closely, was moving fast, visibly almost aggressively. Just apparently not according to some people in us. If you had been sitting in that lecture hall watching one slide after another of confident statistics, would you have questioned it? Or would the numbers have felt convincing enough to simply accept? That contradiction should have raised more eyebrows than it did. And strangely enough, buried in the same years as those confident lecture halls, a much quieter paper was already pointing in a completely different direction. In 2007, a research team led by an anthropologist named John Hawkes did something clever. Rather than digging up ancient bones which the technology of that decade simply could not yet handle at any real scale, they studied the genomes of people alive right now looking for a very particular kind of fingerprint. When a helpful new genetic variant sweeps rapidly through a population, it tends to drag a noticeably long, unbroken stretch of surrounding genetic material along with it, almost like a strong swimmer pulling a raft behind them through open water. Old ordinary variants get chopped up generation after generation by the ordinary shuffling of genetics. Freshly favoured ones do not have time for that shuffling to happen yet. Their raft stays remarkably intact. Hawkes and his colleagues looked for exactly that pattern across 3 quite different population groups drawn from Europe, from East Asia, and from West Africa, deliberately spreading their search across the whole width of the human family, rather than leaning on a single continent story. And what they found ran directly against everything the crowded lecture halls were confidently repeating. Selection by their estimate had not slowed at all in recent human history. It had sped up, and not by some small forgettable margin either, but by something nearing a factor of 10 concentrated overwhelmingly within roughly the last 10,000 years. the very same stretch of time worth noticing that Jones had pointed to as the moment human evolution supposedly began winding down. Two groups of serious credentialed scientists working from the same broad field looking at humanity across that same narrow window of time arrived at almost perfectly opposite conclusions. One side said evolution had essentially finished. The other said it had only just shifted into its highest gear yet. And for nearly 2 decades afterward, this stayed exactly what it sounds, like a genuine unresolved argument playing out mostly in academic journals, most people never open, rather than a settled fact either side could claim outright. Here is the piece I find most quietly humbling about this entire episode, and maybe the real lesson worth carrying out of tonight's story so far. Being a respected expert standing at a podium with real credentials behind your name does not automatically make a claim true, especially when that claim happens to flatter the very audience listening to it. Confidence is not evidence. It never has been, no matter how packed the lecture hall gets, or how many people nod along in agreement. Science at its best is not a group of people agreeing loudly with each other. It is a slow, occasionally embarrassing process of checking your favourite ideas against reality and being willing to lose the argument to a stack of data if that is where the truth actually happens to sit. I will admit something to you here quietly just between us. If I had been sitting in that lecture hall myself, coat still on notebook open on my knee, I suspect I would have nodded along too. The argument is built well. It flatters the listener, it uses real numbers, and it is delivered by someone with every right to be trusted. That is exactly what makes bad ideas dangerous sometimes, not that they sound foolish, but that they sound almost completely reasonable. History is oddly generous with examples like this one if you start looking for them. For decades, doctors were confident that stomach ulcers were caused by stress and spicy food, right up until 2 researchers in Australia proved the real cause was a stubborn little bacterium and had to drink a glass of it themselves before anyone believed them. Geologists once dismissed the idea that entire continents could slowly drift across the surface of the Earth, an idea that sounded almost like science fiction, until the ocean floor itself quietly handed over the evidence decades later. Confident, credentialed people getting the story wrong is not rare in the history of science. It might actually be one of the most reliable patterns in it, so which side turned out to be closer to correct? As it happens, neither side had the tool required to settle it properly, not back then. Hawkes and his team were reading faint fingerprints left behind in living people. Clever detective work, but still an educated guess about a past nobody in that room had personally witnessed. Jones was reasoning from birth records and mortality statistics, useful numbers, but numbers that could only tell part of a much larger story. What both sides were missing was something almost embarrassingly simple in hindsight. Actual physical evidence pulled directly from actual people who had actually lived through those exact centuries, rather than clever inference built entirely from those of us who happened to be born afterward. It would take nearly 20 more years and an entirely different branch of science altogether, one that had almost nothing to do with lecture halls or population statistics, before anyone could finally settle the argument with something closer to proof. Not a better guess, not a cleverer model. Actual testimony pulled from the bones of the very people the argument had always been about, and that is precisely the gap a very different kind of scientist would eventually learn to bridge, not through louder arguments or more confident lectures, but through something far stranger and honestly far more patient. Learning how to pull whispers of information out of bone itself, coaxing a kind of testimony from people who'd been silent for thousands of years, and who it turns out had quite a lot left to say. The person who first learned how to make bone speak in any way that actually held up to scrutiny was breaking rules while he did it. Sweden, 1984. a university town called Uppsala cold most of the year, quiet in the particular way old academic towns tend to be, after dark streetlights reflecting faintly off wet cobblestones outside. A young doctoral student is supposed to be spending his nights finishing a thesis about a virus and how it tricks the human immune system. Respectable work, the kind that leads to a stable, sensible career. Instead, most evenings, once the building is emptied out and the other students have gone home, he lets himself back into the laboratory alone, flicking on just one bank of lights, and starts working on something else entirely, something he has told almost nobody about, including the professor supervising his degree. His name is Svante Pääbo, and what he is actually doing quietly after hours is trying to pull deoxyribonucleic acid out of Egyptian mummies. I want you to sit with that image for a second, because I think it says something wonderful about curiosity. Here is a young man fully capable of following the safe expected path laid out for him, choosing instead to spend his evenings alone with 2,000-year-old human remains chasing a question almost nobody else in his field thought was even answerable yet. A professor of archaeology, he had befriended quietly arranged tiny tissue samples from museum mummies in Uppsala and later from a much larger collection in Berlin. Pääbo would examine them under a microscope late at night, half convinced, half hoping that some trace of genetic information might have survived thousands of years sealed inside preserved skin and organ tissue. Can I ask you honestly, is there something in your own life you've quietly chased like that? Something a little outside your assigned lane, something you were not entirely sure would work, but could not quite stop yourself from trying anyway? I ask because I think that particular kind of stubborn curiosity, more than any single piece of equipment, is the real starting point of everything we have talked about so far tonight. In 1985, his gamble appeared to pay off. Pääbo published a paper on his own co-authors in the scientific journal Nature, describing what he believed was genetic material recovered from a 2,400-year-old mummy, a young boy who had died in ancient Egypt. It made him something like a minor celebrity in scientific circles almost overnight. A graduate student working in secret had apparently done what serious funded laboratories had not yet managed. Here is the part of the story I actually find far more admirable than the headline itself, though. Years later, once Pääbo had learned a great deal more about how fragile and easily contaminated ancient genetic material truly is, he went back and looked honestly at his own famous result. And he concluded publicly that it was probably wrong. What he had likely detected was not 2,000-year-old mummy tissue at all, but modern contamination, quite possibly, stray genetic material drifting over from his own unrelated immune system experiments happening in the very same laboratory. I love that detail honestly, maybe more than almost anything else in this whole story. The achievement that first put his name on the map may not have even been real, and instead of quietly hoping nobody noticed, he said so himself, out loud to other scientists. That takes a particular kind of backbone. It would have been so easy to let a flattering headline stand uncorrected. You have to understand this was not some isolated embarrassment either. The whole young field of pulling genetic material out of ancient remains was at that point something like a minefield of wishful thinking. Sensational claims were everywhere throughout the 1980s and into the early 90s. Scientists announced genetic material recovered from insects trapped inside amber for tens of millions of years, claims exciting enough to help inspire an entire blockbuster movie about cloning dinosaurs a few years later, the kind of film that if you were a certain age when it came out absolutely terrified you, and also made you desperately want to become a paleontologist by the following Tuesday. Almost every one of those early sensational claims, without exception, eventually collapsed under closer inspection. The genetic material researchers thought they had found ancient was again and again simply modern contamination, sometimes from careless handling. sometimes from the very air inside an ordinary laboratory, drifting onto a sample and quietly ruining it. So Paabo did something unusually disciplined for a field this exciting and this young. Rather than chasing the next headline, he became almost obsessive about proving himself wrong before anyone else could. Repeating experiments in separate laboratories, testing for contamination constantly, treating every promising result as guilty until it survived brutal repeated cross-examination. It is slow, unglamorous work, the opposite of the flashy image most of us picture when we hear the phrase ancient genetic material. But it is exactly the kind of quiet discipline that eventually turns a wild guess into something the rest of the scientific world can actually trust. 12 years after that shaky, ultimately mistaken mummy paper, the patients paid off in a way that made history properly this time. Part of what changed in the years between those two moments was not just Paabo's own discipline, but a genuine shift in the tools available to him. Ancient genetic material is not just old, it is shattered, broken down over centuries into short, fragile pieces present in such tiny quantities that older laboratory methods simply could not detect it reliably at all. What changed everything was a chemistry technique developed in the middle of that same decade one that let scientists take an almost impossibly small trace of genetic material and copy it over and over, doubling it again and again in a matter of hours, until there was finally enough of it sitting in a test tube to actually study with confidence. Without that leap, most of what we have talked about tonight simply would not have been possible yet, no matter how patient or careful anyone happened to be. In the summer of 1997, Paabo and a small team of colleagues now working out of a laboratory in Munich put that new capability to its first serious test on something far older and far stranger than any mummy. Back in 1856, quarry workers digging in a limestone cave in Germany's Neander Valley had uncovered a strange thick set of bones, a low sloping skull with heavy ridges above the eyes, unlike anything found before. Those bones eventually gave an entire extinct branch of the human family its very name, the Neanderthals. And now, 141 years after quarrymen first pulled those bones out of the ground, half convinced they belonged to an unusually sturdy bear, Paabo's team pulled something out of them nobody had ever managed to retrieve from an extinct human relative, before a small fragment of surviving genetic code passed down only through mothers quietly waiting inside that arm bone the entire time. It was the very first time in history anyone had directly recovered and studied genetic material belonging to an extinct species of human. Not a close cousin, species like a chimpanzee, but an actual branch of humanity itself gone for tens of thousands of years, suddenly briefly audible again. 13 years after that, in 2010, Paabo's team, now settled at a purpose-built research institute in Leipzig, Germany, went much further still. Working from small bone fragments belonging to 3 Neanderthal individuals uncovered in a cave in Croatia, they assembled a rough first draft of the Neanderthal genome in something closer to its entirety, roughly 3 billion individual letters of genetic code painstakingly reconstructed piece by piece. And buried inside that reconstruction was a discovery that rewrote a question people had been arguing about for well over a century. Did our species and the Neanderthals ever actually meet? And did they ever have children together? The answer turned out to be yes. If your ancestry traces back to Europe-Asia, or almost anywhere outside Africa, there is a real chance that somewhere between 1 and 4% of your own genetic code did not come from modern humans at all. It came from Neanderthals carried forward quietly through tens of thousands of years, all the way into you sitting there right now. Take a slow breath with me for a second and actually sit with that. An entire species one that vanished from the earth roughly 40,000 years ago, one that most of us grew up picturing as a crude evolutionary dead end, a losing branch replaced entirely by better, smarter humans, never really disappeared completely at all. A small, quiet piece of them is very possibly inside your own cells, tonight inherited without your permission, without your knowledge, passed down through so many generations that not one single person along that entire chain ever knew they were carrying it forward. And Paabo was not finished surprising the world, yet not even close. In 2008, Russian archaeologists working in a remote cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, a place called Denisova Cave, found something almost laughably small to build a discovery around a single fragment of a finger bone so nondescript, so lacking in any distinctive shape that nobody could confidently say which species it even belonged to just by looking at it. It eventually made its way to Paabo's laboratory in Leipzig anyway, mostly out of habit and hope, rather than genuine expectation. What his team found inside that fingertip-sized fragment did not match modern humans. It did not match Neanderthals either. It matched nothing anyone had ever catalogued before. An entirely unknown branch of the human family tree one science had never even suspected existed, identified from a single bone fragment, too small and too shapeless to tell you anything on its own. Researchers name this newly discovered group the Denisovans, after the cave where that lone finger bone had been quietly waiting. And later testing revealed that some populations living today in parts of Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands carry up to 6% Denisovan genetic material in their own bodies, a whole hidden branch of humanity's family tree discovered not through some grand dramatic skeleton, but through a single overlooked finger bone smaller than your own thumb. I find something almost unbearably moving about that particular detail, if I am being completely honest with you. An entire population of ancient humans unknown to science for the whole of recorded history was found again not through their art, not through their tools, not even through their bones in any recognizable sense, but simply because one careful scientist finally learned how to listen closely enough to what a few fragments of genetic code were quietly trying to say. Somewhere on this planet tonight there is a real possibility that you or someone you love is walking around carrying a small, quiet trace of a species that science itself did not even know existed until a little over a decade ago. Does that change how you think about what it actually means to be human even slightly? I know it changed something for me the first time I sat with it properly. In October of 2022, Svante Paabo received the Nobel Prize in the category of Physiology or Medicine, honoured specifically for his discoveries concerning the genomes of extinct relatives of modern humans and what they reveal about our own evolution. News cameras gathered outside a research building in Leipzig that morning, and reporters described him looking almost stunned standing beside a plaster model of a Neanderthal skull, the same lineage of bones that had quietly defined his entire working life. The same man who once crept into an empty laboratory after dark, terrified his own supervisor might find out, stood on one of the most respected stages in the entire scientific world, decades later being celebrated for exactly that same stubborn curiosity he once had to hide. It is worth pausing on the shape of that whole life for a moment start to finish. A secret hobby nobody approved of. A famous early result that turned out to be wrong. Years of unglamorous, repetitive laboratory discipline nobody outside the field ever heard about. And then slowly one true discovery after another, each one a little larger than the last, until an entire branch of science existed that had not existed before he started chasing it. Here is the piece worth carrying forward from all of this, I think. Every single discovery we have talked about tonight so far, going all the way back to that farmer's tiny fragment of bone sitting inside a vial in a laboratory in Massachusetts, only exists because one persistent, occasionally wrong, endlessly patient scientist spent decades proving that bones could be trusted to speak at all. But there is a real difference worth noticing here too. Pabo's breakthroughs, remarkable as they were, still came one skeleton at a time, one cave at a time, often years of careful work behind every single genome. A single Neanderthal, a single finger bone, a single hard one answer at a time. Getting from that a handful of extraordinary genomes recovered across an entire career to studying the deep genetic history of an entire continent, thousands upon thousands of ordinary people, at once, the way scientists are doing right now required an entirely different kind of leap altogether. Not a smarter scientist, not a luckier bone. Something closer to turning painstaking artisanal detective work into something that could run quietly and relentlessly at an almost industrial scale. The answer to that puzzle, it turns out, did not come from a smarter version of the same slow, careful process. It came from an entirely different kind of discovery, one made not in a genetics laboratory at all, but in an anatomy department, by a researcher asking a question almost nobody else had thought to ask properly. Which part of a human skeleton out of every single bone in the body actually holds on to genetic material the longest? It sounds like such a simple question, almost too simple to matter. But entire fields of science have a habit of quietly stalling out for years, not because anyone lacked intelligence or ambition, but because nobody had yet asked the one plain, almost childlike question sitting underneath all the more complicated ones. A team based at University College Dublin, led by an archaeologist named Ron Pinhasi, spent years quietly testing exactly that question, bone by bone, sample by sample, grinding tiny amounts of powder from rib tooth and skull alike, then measuring patiently exactly how much usable genetic material each one actually gave back. It is not glamorous work, if I am honest with you. Nobody writes movies about carefully weighing bone dust, and yet in 2015 that quiet, repetitive testing produced a finding that reshaped the entire field almost overnight. Tucked deep inside the skull, protecting the delicate structures of the inner ear, sits an unusually dense, unusually hard little bone called the petrous bone. Pinhasi's team discovered that this one specific bone could yield on average roughly 100 times more usable genetic material than an ordinary tooth or rib. In some individual cases, the difference climbed even higher than that, closer to 180 times more. Let that sink in for a moment, because I think it is easy to skim past a statistic like that without really feeling its weight. 100 times is not a modest improvement. 100 times is the difference between spending a year coaxing a single, readable genome out of a fragile old bone and being able to process an entire room full of skeletons in roughly the same span of time. David Reich himself, the geneticist, we have already spent some time with tonight, later described this particular little bone as something like a genuine game changer for the whole discipline. And having sat with this story for a while now, I do not think that description is exaggerated even slightly. So here is a question worth pausing on for a second. Isn't it a little humbling that one of the biggest leaps forward in understanding the deep history of our entire species came down to a bone most of us cannot even locate on our own skull without looking it up? Not a grander laboratory, not a more brilliant theory, just someone finally asking the right, oddly specific question about anatomy. I find a strange kind of comfort in that, honestly. It suggests that the next enormous leap forward in almost any field rarely needs a genius nobody has met yet. It just needs someone patient enough to ask a plain question that everyone else assumed had already been answered. With that discovery paired alongside newer, faster, dramatically cheaper sequencing machines, something that had been essentially a cottage industry for 3 decades, quietly turned into something closer to a production line. Individual ancient genomes once counted in the dozens across an entire career started arriving by the thousands, By the time the study we've been circling around tonight was finally published, researchers had assembled genetic information from precisely 15,836 people who had lived across West Eurasia, a little over 10,000 of those genomes brand new, never analysed before by anyone. That kind of number simply did not exist for this field a decade earlier. It could not have. The bone itself had not yet given up its secret. But here is where the story gets truly interesting, at least to me, because having more raw material was only half the battle. Once researchers had all of these genomes stretched across thousands of years, an enormous stubborn problem was still sitting right in the middle of the table. How do you actually tell the difference between a genetic trait that spread because it helped people survive and reproduce, and one that simply spread because a group of people carrying it happened to move somewhere new or married into a neighbouring community, or simply got lucky through nothing more meaningful than random chance? This is not a small technical footnote. It might be the single hardest problem in this entire branch of science. Think about it this way for a moment. Picture a particular trait becoming twice as common in a population over the span of 2,000 years. On the surface, that sounds like a textbook case of evolution, rewarding something useful. But that exact same pattern could just as easily appear if an entirely new group of people who simply happened to carry that trait already moved into the region and gradually mixed with everyone already living there. From the outside, both stories can look nearly identical. A number climbing steadily upward across time. The genuine reason underneath it, though, is completely different in each case, and mistaking one for the other would mean building an entire conclusion about our biology on top of a coincidence. A researcher at Harvard named Ali Akbari, working closely alongside Reich, spent years developing a way to tell these two stories apart with real statistical confidence, rather than simply guessing. The approach itself is almost elegant in how it works. Instead of asking whether a genetic trait becomes more common, overall his method tracks how that same trait behaves across three sharply distinct chapters of ancient European life in sequence hunter-gatherer communities who lived before farming existed, the first generations of farmers who followed them, and later horse-riding herders who swept in from the steppes further east. If a trait rises consistently through all three of those very different chapters generation after generation, regardless of who exactly was in charge of a given region, or which culture happened to be dominant at the time, that steady repeated climb becomes a far stronger signal of something biological actually being rewarded. A single lucky jump tied to one migration event tends to look completely different under this kind of scrutiny, more like a sudden step than a patient-sustained climb. Imagine two entirely different graphs sitting side by side for a moment. One shows a trait creeping upward slowly across each of those three chapters, a little higher among the farmers than among the hunter-gatherers before them, then higher again among the herders who came after, patient and consistent the whole way through. The other shows a trait that barely exists at all, until one single population arrives from somewhere else, carrying plenty of it already, and the overall number jumps sharply in a single generation before flattening out again. Both graphs glanced at quickly might look like they're simply telling you a trait became more common. Only one of them is actually describing evolution rewarding something useful. The other one is really just describing people moving house. I like to think of it a little like separating a single true steady note from a room full of noise. Migration and population mixing tend to sound like sudden loud crashes, dramatic and easy to notice, but ultimately short-lived. Real sustained natural selection sounds quieter and much harder to fake closer to one instrument, holding a single note steadily beneath everything else, hour after hour, long after the louder, more dramatic sounds around it have already faded away. Here is a question for you, honestly, because I am curious. If you had been the one sitting with 15,000 ancient genomes and this same puzzle in front of you, would you have trusted a pattern that appeared just once, or would you have wanted to see it survive scrutiny across several completely different chapters of history before believing it the way this team eventually chose to? I like to think I would have wanted the patient version. I'm not entirely sure if I am honest that I would have had the discipline for it. Once Akbari's method had been tested, checked, and quietly proven against known cases, scientists were already confident about the team pointed it at the full dataset and waited to see what would actually survive. The results were almost startling in how restrained they turned out to be. By their own calculations, honest directional selection, the real biological kind only accounted for somewhere around 2% of every genetic change they could measure across those thousands of years. Everything else, the overwhelming majority of it, came from migration mixing and the ordinary statistical noise that naturally occurs inside any population, small or large. 2% might sound almost disappointing at first, a strangely modest number to build an entire groundbreaking paper around. But spread that same 2% across billions of individual letters of genetic code, and it still adds up to something enormous. Within that narrow, carefully filtered slice, the team identified 479 specific genetic variants they could say with real statistical confidence had been actively and repeatedly favoured or actively pushed away by the pressures of survival and reproduction across the last 10,000 years. There is a lesson tucked inside that small percentage that I think reaches well beyond genetics, honestly. So much of what actually shapes a life or a species rarely announces itself loudly. It is not the 98% of noise and coincidence that ends up defining the story in the long run. It is the quiet, patient 2% underneath it, easy to miss if you are not looking closely enough or willing to wait long enough to see it clearly. And they were careful, refreshingly careful, in my opinion, not to overstate what they had found either. Beyond those 479 confirmed cases, the team flagged more than 7,600 additional locations across the genome that showed better than even odds of representing real selection too, without quite clearing the strict bar required for full confidence yet. Rather than rushing to announce all of it as settled fact, they published that longer, messier list openly, instead essentially handing every other laboratory in the world an enormous, carefully labelled homework assignment, an invitation to come check their work, rather than simply take their word for it. That, to me, might be the most quietly impressive part of this entire chapter. It would have been so easy to round up to claim a slightly bigger, flashier number, and nobody outside a small circle of specialists would likely have noticed or cared. It happens more often than most of us would like to admit in plenty of fields well beyond science. A cautious, honest answer rarely trends the way an overstated one does. They chose the more honest, more modest number instead, and handed their homework to the rest of the world besides. There is something worth sitting with here about how dramatically this kind of science has changed shape over the years too. The story from earlier tonight, the one about a single stubborn researcher chasing mummies alone at night, decades of one determined person, slowly earning the field's trust one careful bone at a time that was real, and it mattered enormously. But this newer chapter looks almost nothing like that anymore. This is a study built by dozens of listed collaborators, drawing on work from roughly 270 archaeologists, spread across universities and museums on nearly every continent, funded across multiple countries, reviewed by outside statisticians before anyone was willing to trust the results. Look at the list of names attached to a paper like this one, and you find contributors working out of Boston, out of Vienna, out of Tehran, out of laboratories on nearly every continent that has ever had ancient human remains, worth studying, each one responsible for some small, careful piece of a puzzle None of them could have assembled entirely on their own. One archaeologist might spend a single career carefully excavating and cataloguing a few dozen burials from one particular valley, never personally seeing the larger pattern their work eventually became part of. A statistician on another continent entirely might never once hold a bone in their hands, yet still be the person who finally proves whether a signal buried inside that valley's data was real. Science at this particular scale has quietly stopped being the story of one brilliant, isolated mind working alone in a laboratory at midnight and become something closer to an enormous, patient worldwide choir, each voice contributing one small, carefully verified note. And once that method had finally been trusted, tested, and set loose on the full mountain of data these researchers had assembled, one of the very first places its light landed was not a war, and not a plague, and not some dramatic invasion sweeping across a continent. It landed on something almost embarrassingly ordinary by comparison, the kind of change that happens quietly around a fire at the end of an otherwise unremarkable day. It landed on what people had started putting in their mouths, and on what that single humble choice quietly did to the bodies of everyone who came after them. Here is something most of us were never taught properly in school, and I think it deserves a moment of real attention before we go any further tonight. Farming, the single invention we usually credit with saving humanity, with finally giving us stability cities and everything that followed after, did not actually make the first several generations of farmers healthier. In a great many places it made them noticeably worse off. Researchers who study old skeletons for a living, comparing the bones of hunter-gatherers against the bones of the earliest farmers who came directly after them in the very same regions, keep finding the same uncomfortable pattern again and again. The early farmers were shorter sometimes by a meaningful amount, several centimetres lost, across just a handful of generations in some regions studied. Their teeth show far more decay and far more damage, the direct fingerprint of a diet suddenly built around sticky fermentable starch, rather than tougher wild plants and lean meat. Their bones carry more visible signs of nutritional stress during childhood, little grooves and pits that form when a growing body is not getting quite enough of what it needs. A diet built mostly around a single starchy crop wheat barley or later rice turned out to be a poor substitute for the wide varied, protein-rich diet their hunter-gatherer ancestors had quietly enjoyed for tens of thousands of years before them. Isn't that a strange thing to sit with for a moment? The single decision most of us were taught to think of as humanity finally getting things right may have actually made everyday life measurably harder for a good long while first. Farming did not succeed because it made individual lives immediately better. It succeeded because it let far more people survive in the same amount of land, even if each one of those people on average was a little shorter, a little sicker, and living a little closer to the edge than their ancestors once had. And it is precisely inside that uncomfortable, imperfect transition that some of the clearest evidence of human evolution still in progress happens to live. Let's start with a story most people have at least half heard somewhere before, even if they never quite understood the details, because I think the real version is far stranger and far more interesting than the simplified one that usually gets passed around. Nearly every mammal on this planet, humans included, is built to stop digesting milk properly somewhere around the end of infancy. It makes a strange kind of biological sense once you think about it. Milk exists, evolutionarily speaking, to feed a nursing infant. Once weaning happens, the gene responsible for producing the enzyme that breaks down milk sugar quietly switches itself off and stays off for the rest of that animal's life. For the overwhelming majority of human history, adults simply could not comfortably digest milk, and there was no particular reason for that to ever change. Then, sometime around 8,000 years ago in parts of what is now Turkey, and not long after in parts of present-day Hungary and Romania, something new began showing up: residue from actual dairy products, preserved chemically inside the walls of ancient pottery. Farming communities had begun keeping goats, sheep and cattle, and they were extracting milk from them deliberately on purpose, as an ongoing food source, rather than simply eating the animal itself once. Here is where the story gets truly surprising, and where I think most casual retellings quietly get it wrong. You might reasonably assume that the ability to digest milk into adulthood spread alongside dairy farming itself hand in hand, the two arriving together as a matching set. It did not happen that way at all. When scientists later extracted genetic material directly from the skeletons of those early farming communities, the very people whose pottery clearly proves they were already using dairy products, the genetic mutation allowing adults to digest milk comfortably was almost completely absent. Not rare, essentially absent. Entire farming cultures known for keeping dairy animals generation after generation still overwhelmingly lacked the biological tools to properly digest what they were drinking. Can you picture that for a second? Whole communities raising livestock specifically for milk, likely turning much of it into something closer to yogurt, or a simple soft cheese foods, where fermentation quietly breaks down most of the difficult sugar before anyone ever swallows a bite, while the biological upgrade that would have let them drink it comfortably straight and fresh had not caught up yet at all. That gap did not narrow quickly either. Genetic material recovered from skeletons belonging to steppe herding cultures who lived roughly 5,000 years ago, communities you might reasonably expect to have been drinking enormous quantities of milk given their entire way of life, still shows almost no trace of the mutation. The very earliest confirmed genetic evidence for it does not appear until a burial dated to roughly 4,300 years ago, and it did not become common across Europe until somewhere between roughly 4,000 and 3,500 years ago, spreading rapidly outward from somewhere near present-day Ukraine. Read those numbers back for a moment slowly. Dairy farming in some regions is nearly 8,500 years old. Widespread genetic tolerance for it is only around 4,000 years old at most. For something like 4,000 years more than the entire span of recorded human history from the pyramids to right now, people were living and working directly alongside a food source their own bodies had not yet fully learned how to handle. Once that mutation finally did take hold, though it spread with a kind of biological force rarely seen anywhere else in the human genome. Geneticists who study the strength of natural selection describe this particular trait as among the single most powerfully selected genetic changes documented anywhere in recent human history, stronger by some measures than nearly anything else evolution has done to our species across the same stretch of time. Carrying that one small mutation in the right time and place appears to have meaningfully increased a person's odds of surviving and successfully raising children of their own generation after generation, strongly enough that the trait spread through the population still stands out clearly thousands of years later in the genetic record. Can I ask you something honestly before we go further? Do you personally know whether you carry this trait? Does a glass of milk sit easily with you, or does your own body still quietly hold on to that older, more ancient setting your entire species carried for the vast majority of its history? There is no wrong answer here whichever way it goes for you. If anything, feeling a little uncomfortable after dairy simply means your own body is still running. The original default human setting largely unchanged since long before farming ever began. In a strange way, discomfort is the ancestral condition. Comfort is the recent update. It does make me smile a little thinking about how much shelf space our modern grocery stores now devote to oat milk, almond milk, and every other alternative imaginable quietly built for exactly the biological majority of the human species that farming's grand milk experiment never fully caught up with in the first place. And here is a detail I find almost more remarkable than the mutation itself. Europe was not the only place this particular biological trick was independently discovered. At least a handful of separate cattle herding populations scattered elsewhere across the world, including groups in parts of Eastern Africa, whose entire way of life has long centered around cattle, evolved their own completely different genetic mutations, arriving at the very same practical outcome through a completely different biological pathway. Nobody copied anybody else's homework here. Different populations facing a closely matched problem arrived at strikingly similar solutions using entirely separate genetic tools discovered independently worlds apart from one another. I find something oddly comforting in that particular fact, if I am honest. Evolution is not one narrow path that only certain lucky populations happen to stumble onto first. Given a similar enough pressure, similar solutions have a real tendency to show up again and again, invented independently in places that never had any contact with each other at all. At the same time, it is worth resisting the urge to make this story sound tidier than it actually is, because plenty of dairy-dependent cultures never developed this particular mutation at all, and still thrive perfectly well today. Herding communities across parts of Central Asia, for instance, remain largely without the trait, despite relying heavily on milk from their animals across many centuries. They simply lean more heavily on fermentation, instead transforming milk into products naturally lower in the sugar that would otherwise cause them discomfort. Biology offered one elegant solution. Culture quietly offered another equally effective one right alongside it. Neither path was more correct than the other. They were simply two different answers to the exact same practical question. Milk was never the whole story of what farming did to our bodies either. A second quieter transformation was happening at almost exactly the same time. This one centered on starch rather than sugar, on bread and grain rather than milk. Human saliva contains an enzyme that begins breaking down starch, technically speaking the moment food enters your mouth, well before it even reaches your stomach. The gene responsible for that enzyme comes in a strange, almost unusual form. Rather than existing as a single fixed copy, the way most genes do, different people can carry a wildly different number of copies of it, anywhere from just a couple all the way up to 20 or more, an unusually wide range for something so directly tied to daily digestion. For a while, popular science writing settled comfortably on a tidy explanation for this variation, that populations with long histories of starch, heavy farming simply evolved more copies over time, a straightforward reward for a grain-based diet. The truth, once researchers finally sequenced this stretch of the genome properly using far more advanced tools, turned out to be considerably messier and honestly more interesting than that simple version. Some of the raw genetic material behind these extra copies has been sitting quietly in our ancestors' genomes for a very long time, hundreds of thousands of years, long before anyone on Earth had ever planted a single seed on purpose. Farming did not invent the extra copies from nothing. It appears instead to have leaned on raw material that was already sitting there, favouring and multiplying it further once a starch-heavy diet actually arrived and made those extra copies truly useful. And in a lovely, very recent discovery that barely anybody outside a small circle of specialists has heard about, yet researchers studying communities high in the Andes Mountains of South America found a strikingly similar pattern, playing out independently timed almost perfectly alongside the domestication of an entirely different crop than the one most of these stories usually focus on, the humble potato. Different continent, different staple food entirely, yet the very same genetic strategy, quietly multiplying extra copies of the same starch-digesting gene showing up again on its own. I love that detail honestly more than I probably should. It suggests something almost tender about how flexible and endlessly resourceful human biology actually is underneath everything else. Wherever people settled down and leaned hard into a particular staple crop, whether wheat in one hemisphere or potatoes in another, entirely separated by an ocean and thousands of years, something quietly similar happened underneath the surface of their bodies, largely without a single person involved ever knowing it was happening at all. So here is where I think tonight's real lesson about farming actually lives if I had to name just one. This was never a clean one-directional story of humans simply getting smarter and better adapted with every single passing generation, the tidy version most of us grew up assuming. It was messier than that and honestly more human because of it. People kept animals for milk centuries before their own bodies could properly handle it. People built entire civilizations around grain before their saliva had fully caught up with the diet they had already chosen for themselves. Progress in biology, it turns out, rarely arrive hand in hand perfectly synchronized. Culture tends to race ahead first, reckless, and a little impatient, and biology follows along quietly behind it, taking its own sweet time, sometimes centuries, sometimes millennia, to finally catch up. There is something almost reassuring in that if you let it sit for a while. We tend to imagine our ancestors as either helplessly primitive or triumphantly clever, one or the other with nothing messy in between. The real picture is neither. They were improvising, constantly making bold decisions about food and survival with bodies that had not yet been given the chance to catch up with their own ambition. In a way, we are still doing exactly the same thing today, just with different foods and different timelines too short for any of us to notice while we are living through them. But not every single one of those dietary experiments our ancestors ran on themselves entirely, without meaning to actually worked out in our favour in the end. Some of them left behind something considerably more complicated than an upgrade, a genuine lasting vulnerability. One written directly into the genetic code of millions of people still living with the consequences of a decision made by people who've been dead for thousands of years. That particular vulnerability has a name most of us have heard mentioned in passing, usually on a food label or from a friend carefully scanning a restaurant menu for something safe to order. Celiac disease. And I want to be honest with you before we go any further, because I think the real story here is stranger and considerably more humbling than most explanations you will find casually floating around online. Celiac disease happens when a person's own immune system mistakes a protein found in wheat, barley and rye, called gluten, for a genuine threat, and responds accordingly, attacking the lining of that person's small intestine every single time they eat something as ordinary as a slice of bread. Over years, that repeated misdirected attack can quietly wear down the very tissue responsible for absorbing nutrients in the first place, leaving a person exhausted, malnourished, and in a great deal of discomfort, sometimes for years before anyone properly figures out why. It is a strange kind of betrayal. If you think about it long enough, a body turning one of its own defenses against something as harmless and as central to daily life as dinner. For a long while, the working assumption among scientists studying this condition felt entirely reasonable, almost obvious once you say it out loud. Surely a trait this clearly harmful one that actively punishes people for eating one of the most common staple foods on the entire planet should have been slowly filtered out of the population over thousands of years, the way a truly dangerous mutation almost always eventually is. Evolution is supposed to weed out the things that hurt us, isn't it? That was the quiet, comfortable assumption sitting underneath most of the research for a long time, repeated in textbooks and lecture halls without much argument. Then scientists actually pulled genetic material directly out of skeletons old enough to test that assumption properly, rather than simply guessing backward from populations alive today, and the story that came back did not match the comfortable version at all. Deep inside a particularly busy stretch of our genetic code on the same chromosome, responsible for so much of how our immune system recognizes friend from foe, sits a small cluster of genes involved in identifying invading microbes. One particular version of this cluster, when a person inherits 2 copies of it, one from each parent, raises that person's risk of developing celiac disease by something nearing 19 times over someone who carries none of it at all. 19 times. That is not a subtle nudge. That is one of the strongest single genetic risk factors linked to any autoimmune condition scientists have ever managed to measure with real precision. Here is where the story stopped following the script almost everyone expected. Rather than slowly fading out of the population over the centuries the way something this costly arguably should have researchers tracking this exact genetic marker across thousands of years of preserved bone found the frequency doing something nearing the opposite. Starting from something close to non-existent, this particular risk variant climbed steadily upward, generation after generation, until it now sits in roughly 1 out of every 5 people carrying at least 1 copy of it across a span of only around 4,000 years, an astonishingly short window in evolutionary terms for a change this large to take hold. For comparison, that is a faster, sharper climb than the vast majority of the genetic changes we've already talked about tonight, most of which took considerably longer to spread even half as far. Can I be honest with you about something? When I first came across that number properly, I had to sit back for a moment because it truly unsettled me a little. A geneticist closely involved with uncovering this pattern put it almost exactly the way I felt reading it myself, admitting that most researchers, himself included, at first had quietly assumed this variant should have been growing rarer over time, precisely because widespread wheat consumption should have been steadily punishing anyone unfortunate enough to carry it. Instead, it did the reverse entirely. People kept eating more wheat generation after generation, and the genetic vulnerability to it kept spreading right alongside that same rising tide of bread rather than shrinking away from it. Sit with that contradiction for a second, because I think it is worth actually feeling rather than simply nodding along to. How does something make you sick, sometimes seriously, and still manage to spread more widely through an entire population over time, rather than quietly disappearing the way basic logic would suggest it should? The honest answer, the one researchers are still actively working through even now, is that evolution rarely deals in single, clean transactions. It deals almost entirely in trade-offs, messy ones, the kind where something truly costly on one side of the ledger can still get carried forward if it happens to be quietly paying for something valuable on the other side, something that mattered enormously at the time, even if it looks completely invisible to us now looking backward with modern eyes. One leading idea centers on exactly what that stretch of genetic code actually does for a living the rest of the time, which is help your immune system recognize dangerous invaders in the first place. A version of this genetic machinery tuned to react a little more aggressively, a little more suspiciously toward foreign proteins might, at least in theory, be somewhat better at catching genuine threats to actual bacteria, actual dangerous microbes at a moment in history when a single untreated infection could realistically end a person's life within days. Think of it almost like a security guard trained to be a little too watchful. They will occasionally stop an innocent visitor by mistake, mildly frustrating, admittedly. But that same jumpy alertness might also be exactly what catches the one genuine intruder that a more relaxed guard would have quietly let stroll right through the front door. An immune system tuned toward heightened suspicion pays a real cost when it misfires against something harmless like gluten. But that exact same heightened suspicion might have been saving lives elsewhere quietly, constantly against threats considerably more dangerous than a slice of bread ever was. There is a second hypothesis floating around this same puzzle that I find almost oddly charming, honestly, precisely because of how unglamorous it is. A handful of researchers have proposed that this same genetic variant may have offered some measure of protection against severe tooth decay of all things, back when dental infections were a startlingly common cause of death, long before anyone had antibiotics or dentists, or so much as a proper toothbrush. An abscessed tooth in the ancient world was not a minor inconvenience you scheduled an appointment around. It could turn into a genuine lethal infection, with almost no warning at all, the bacteria working their way from an inflamed root straight into the bloodstream. If a slightly overactive immune response happened to offer even a modest edge against that particular danger, it might have been worth the occasional stomachache after dinner 1,000 times over, especially across a lifetime where losing a molar could very plausibly mean losing your life not long after. It is a strange thing to picture honestly a farmer somewhere in ancient Anatolia, or the Balkans wincing through a painful tooth, never once realizing that the very same genetic quirk, quietly protecting them from a fatal infection in their jaw, was also the reason their stomach occasionally ached after a hearty meal of bread. Two consequences wildly different in seriousness, both quietly traceable to the exact same tiny stretch of genetic code. I do want to be careful with you here because I think intellectual honesty matters more than a tidy ending. Neither of these explanations has been proven beyond doubt yet. Scientists are still actively arguing over exactly which hidden benefit, if either, truly explains why this particular trade-off was worth making for so many generations in a row. It is entirely possible the real answer turns out to be some combination of both ideas, or something else entirely that nobody has proposed convincingly yet. What we do know with real confidence now is that some kind of trade-off almost certainly existed. Nothing this costly climbs this high, this quickly, purely by accident. Random chance alone simply does not produce numbers this dramatic, this consistently across a population this large. Here is something worth turning over slowly for a moment if you are willing. Somewhere in the world tonight there is a real chance that you yourself, or someone sitting close enough to hear this story alongside you, carries this exact genetic legacy, one small piece of a 4,000-year-old bargain, struck by people who never once knew they were making it, and who could not possibly have known how their own great-grandchildren, dozens of generations removed, would eventually end up quietly reading ingredient labels in a grocery store because of it. There is something else worth noticing too, something a little more geographically specific and honestly a little more revealing about how slowly this whole process actually plays out. Populations whose ancestors have been eating wheat the longest places where farming took root earliest tend to show somewhat lower rates of celiac disease today than populations who only adopted wheat relatively recently in comparison. It is almost as though the earliest wheat-eating communities have simply had more time, more centuries, more opportunities for this particular trade-off to keep quietly rebalancing itself generation after generation, while communities newer to the same diet are still somewhere in the middle of that same long, slow negotiation happening right now, in real time inside people who have absolutely no idea it is even taking place. I find that pattern quietly fascinating, honestly, because it reframes something we usually think of as a fixed, unchanging diagnosis into something closer to a population still mid-conversation with its own dinner table. Give it enough centuries, enough generations, quietly filtering the outcome one dinner at a time, and the balance keeps shifting ever so slightly without a single person alive ever choosing it on purpose. I think there is a truly important lesson buried inside this whole uncomfortable little chapter 1 that reaches well past bread and immune cells if you let it. We tend to imagine evolution as some kind of quiet perfectionist, endlessly polishing our species towards some imaginary, finished, flawless version of ourselves. It is not that at all, and I think it never really was. Evolution does not care whether you personally feel your best. It only cares whether you survive long enough and stay healthy enough to have children who go on to do the very same thing after you. A trait that quietly makes millions of individual lives a little harder can still spread through an entire population without contradiction, so long as it keeps tipping the scales towards survival and reproduction, just often enough on average across enough generations to be worth carrying forward. There is something almost humbling in realizing that your own body was never actually built for your comfort in the first place, not really. It was built patiently and a little indifferently for the comfort of your ancestors' odds of survival, thousands of years before you existed to have any opinion on the matter at all. We inherit the trade-off, not the vote. Can I ask you something a little more personal before we move on tonight? Do you know anyone in your own life living with celiac disease or a gluten sensitivity that never quite got a name, never quite got taken seriously by a doctor who assumed it was simply stress or an overly sensitive stomach? If you do, there is a real chance you're looking quite literally at one small living page of this exact same 4,000-year-old story still being written one dinner at a time in a body that has absolutely no idea it is carrying history inside it. There is a small wry irony sitting at the bottom of all this too, one I cannot resist pointing out before we move along tonight. An entire modern food industry now exists almost entirely around removing the very ingredient our ancestors spent thousands of years learning to farm worship and build entire civilizations around in the first place. Somewhere a Neolithic farmer who once nearly starved to protect a fragile field of wheat from frost drought and hungry birds would probably find it a little baffling that an entire aisle of the modern grocery store is now dedicated to living without it priced at a small premium besides. But celiac disease was never the only place this particular slice of our genetic code was quietly being rewritten either. The very same stretch of the human immune system that learned to overreact to a harmless protein in bread was at almost exactly the same moment in history being pulled in an entirely different direction too, towards something considerably larger than any single food. Toward an all-out centuries-long war against the diseases themselves. To understand that particular war properly, you first have to understand what actually changed the moment humans stopped wandering and decided for the first time in the entire history of our species to stay in one place, for roughly 200,000 years before any of this small bands of humans moved constantly following animals, following seasons, following whatever the land happened to offer that particular month. 20, maybe 30 people, rarely more, camping somewhere for a handful of weeks before packing up everything they owned and moving on again. A group that size spread thin and moving often simply does not give a disease much room to work with. An illness that spreads only through close repeated contact tends to burn out quickly in a population that small and that mobile. There are only so many people nearby to infect before everyone either recovers or the group has already moved on entirely, leaving whatever sickness lingered behind them in the empty campsite. Then, around 10,000 years ago, that entire arrangement quietly flipped upside down. People built permanent homes out of mud, brick and timber. They packed those homes close together, wall against wall, family against family, forming villages that stayed exactly where they were year after year, generation after generation, the same well-used paths worn into the same patch of earth for decades on end. And crucially, they brought animals to live alongside them, goats, sheep, cattle, pigs, sharing the same water, the same waste, sometimes nearly the same roof in numbers, and at a proximity nothing in our species' prior history had ever remotely resembled. Can you picture what that actually meant, practically speaking, for the microbes living inside all of those bodies pressed so closely together? A settled village full of people who never left, sharing space daily with domesticated animals, carrying their own separate collection of microscopic passengers, was an entirely new kind of opportunity, one that had simply never existed on this planet before at this particular scale. It was without anyone alive at the time having any concept of what a microbe even was, the opening bell of an entirely new kind of contest. One of the clearest examples scientists have actually managed to catch in the act involves an ordinary unglamorous bacterium most of us only think about when we worry about undercooked chicken. Salmonella. Researchers recovered genetic material belonging to this bacterium directly from human skeletons, as old as 6,500 years, pulled from burials scattered across a wide stretch of Western Eurasia. People living through exactly this transition. Foragers becoming herders, herders becoming settled farmers. This is not a simple task worth pausing on for a moment. Finding a fragment of ancient bacterial genetic material tucked inside a human bone that is already thousands of years old is a little like searching for one particular voice inside a stadium recording made decades ago, buried under layers of static and noise that most equipment simply cannot separate out cleanly. And yet patiently across 8 separate skeletons, researchers managed exactly that. And when they lined up those ancient bacterial genomes side by side, ordered by age, something remarkable emerged. The earlier strains recovered were still fairly generalist, capable of infecting a wide range of different mammals, not particularly specialized toward humans specifically. But strain by strain, generation by generation, across roughly 5,000 years, that same bacterial lineage crept steadily closer and closer toward becoming something built almost entirely around one host, in particular us. By the time the most recent ancient sample in that particular study was recovered, the bacterium had picked up genetic tools closely related to the ones still used today by a form of salmonella responsible for causing serious, sometimes lethal fever in humans. Sit with that for a moment, because I think it deserves more than a passing nod. A disease was quietly rebuilding itself, one small mutation at a time, into a more focused version of itself, tailored increasingly toward one particular species at almost exactly the same moment that species was busy building permanent villages and inviting entire herds of livestock to share its water supply. Nobody chose this. Nobody could have seen it happening. 2 separate lineages of life, one microscopic, one considerably larger, were quietly negotiating an entirely new relationship with each other. Neither one aware the negotiation was even taking place. Here is a question worth sitting with for a second, honestly. If a bacterium can spend 5,000 years slowly specializing itself around a single host, doesn't it stand to reason that the host in turn would eventually need to specialize right back? That is exactly what the genetic record shows happening, and this is where our own species starts fighting back quietly and visibly, one generation at a time. Buried inside that same stretch of history, researchers keep finding genetic variants tied directly to the immune system, rising sharply in frequency, right alongside the growing pressure from newly adapted pathogens like the one we just talked about. One gene in particular functions almost like an early alarm system, a molecular sensor built to recognize telltale fragments left behind by a whole range of dangerous bacteria, including the very lineage of Salmonella we just discussed, along with the bacteria responsible for tuberculosis and several others besides. Picture it standing quietly at the door of nearly every cell in your body, checking the identification of anything passing through, ready to sound the alarm the instant it recognizes a familiar unwelcome signature. A separate cluster of genes, this one governing a specialized branch of immune cells, built to detect and destroy infected cells directly, was also caught shifting in frequency during this exact same window. These particular cells work a little differently from most of the immune system. Rather than waiting for a specific previously recognized threat, they patrol, constantly checking whether the cells around them still look healthy, still look like themselves, and moving in swiftly the moment something seems even slightly wrong. Two completely different biological tools sharpening themselves at almost exactly the same moment, on almost exactly the same timeline as the threat itself, was quietly sharpening on the opposite side. I find something almost cinematic about picturing it that way. Honestly, two invisible armies training in the dark, neither one able to see the other clearly, each one only ever responding to whatever pressure the other side happened to apply first. And this arms race, once it properly got started, never really slowed down. Newer research, published only a matter of months ago, now took an even wider look across the entire genome. Rather than focusing narrowly on one bacterium or one particular gene, and the pattern that emerged was almost breathtaking in scope. Across thousands of years, alleles offering meaningfully reduced susceptibility to tuberculosis, to influenza, and to a whole range of intestinal infections, kept showing unmistakable signs of being actively favored again and again across an enormous portion of the genome. This was not one isolated success story tucked away in a single gene somewhere. It was a coordinated, sweeping renovation, touching hundreds of separate locations across our genetic code all at once, all pointed in roughly the same direction, all pushing toward the same broad goal of keeping infection at bay. And these were not scattered randomly either. They clustered heavily around the immune cells stationed at the body's actual front lines, the tissue lining your lungs and the tissue lining your gut, precisely the two places where the outside world and everything dangerous drifting through it first makes physical contact with the inside of your own body. Think about that placement for a second, because I think it is truly elegant once you notice it. Your body was not simply building a stronger immune system somewhere deep inside, tucked safely away the way you might reinforce a vault buried beneath a building. It was reinforcing its actual border checkpoints, specifically the exact doorways pathogens use to get in, the same way a city under repeated siege eventually stops reinforcing random buildings scattered throughout its interior and starts reinforcing its gates instead, precisely where the danger keeps arriving from in the first place. Can I ask you something honestly before we keep going? Think back to the last time you or someone you love came down with something serious, a bad flu, a stubborn stomach bug, anything that kept you in bed for a few uncomfortable days, curtains drawn, unable to face so much as a plain piece of toast. Somewhere underneath that entirely ordinary, forgettable misery, a version of the exact same ancient conflict we've been describing tonight was quietly playing out again inside you, using tools your ancestors spent thousands of years slowly assembling, purely so that a version of you thousands of years later would have half a fighting chance. I think most of us walk through the last several years of a certain worldwide illness without ever once framing it this way, and honestly, I understand why. Nobody wants to sit around thinking about deep evolutionary history while they are simply trying to survive a rough week or homeschool a restless child, or figure out whether it was safe to visit an elderly parent. But step back far enough, and that entire global experience, an unfamiliar pathogen, sweeping through a densely connected, closely packed human population, tracing city to city, household to household, hopping between strangers on crowded trains and in crowded elevators, was not actually a new kind of event at all. It was, in a strange and slightly uncomfortable way, simply the oldest story our species has wearing modern clothing, running at a modern speed, with airports standing in for ancient trade routes and video calls, standing in for whatever news once travelled slowly on foot between distant villages. The tools have changed enormously, obviously. We now have laboratories capable of designing a vaccine within months, rather than waiting on natural selection to slowly work things out across dozens of unlucky generations. But the underlying shape of the problem, a crowded species living in close quarters, constantly offering new opportunities to whatever microbe happens to be paying attention, has not changed nearly as much as most of us probably assume it has. There is a small wry irony sitting inside all of this too, one I do not think we talk about nearly enough. We tend to imagine our immune system as this separate hidden department, somewhere deep inside us, mostly forgettable, mostly irrelevant, right up until the exact moment we catch a cold and suddenly remember it exists at all, grumbling about it the way you might grumble about plumbing. You never think about until the exact night it stops working properly. In reality, it has been running an unbroken 10,000-year-long campaign this entire time, without a single day off, without so much as a lunch break, quietly adjusting itself against threat after threat, long before any of us were born, and it will almost certainly keep doing exactly that long after every person listening to this story tonight is gone too. So here is what I think the real lesson of this particular chapter actually is, if I had to name just one thing. Disease and density have always moved together hand in hand throughout the entirety of human history, each one quietly provoking the other into becoming something sharper, something more specialized, something harder to outrun. Every single time humans changed how closely we chose to live together, our immune systems eventually had no choice but to follow along right behind us, adjusting to match. And we are, whether we think about it often or not, still doing exactly that today, in cities considerably larger and considerably more crowded than anything a Neolithic farmer could have possibly imagined standing in the doorway of their own mud brick home. It makes me wonder, honestly, what a researcher 10,000 years from now might eventually find buried inside our own genetic code, some quiet signature left behind by all of this, by subway systems and international flights, and entire cities holding more people than existed on the whole planet when that first salmonella strain began its slow, patient journey toward becoming something built specifically for us. We rarely think of ourselves as living inside history while it happens, and yet here we are generation after generation doing precisely that, whether we notice it or not. But disease was never the only invisible force quietly reshaping the human genome during this particular stretch of history. Something else entirely was on the move at almost exactly the same time, something far bigger than any single bacterium or any single village. Whole populations on horseback sweeping across an entire continent and carrying an entirely different kind of genetic upheaval along with them. Picture the grasslands stretching across what is now southern Russia and Ukraine, roughly 5,000 years ago, an ocean of open steppe with almost no trees to break the cold air for hundreds of miles in any direction. A people archaeologists now call the Yamnaya lived out here following enormous herds of cattle and sheep across that open country, burying their dead beneath earthen mounds, tall enough to still be visible on the horizon today thousands of years later. They had recently picked up two pieces of technology that together quietly changed the shape of an entire continent. The wheel fitted to sturdy wooden wagons capable of hauling an entire household's belongings across open ground, turning a family's whole life into something that could simply be packed up and moved, and the horse tamed and ridden, rather than simply hunted for meat, turning a single rider into something faster and further reaching than any human being had ever managed to be before, on foot or otherwise. With those two tools alone, distance stopped meaning what it used to mean. A journey that once would have taken a walking group of hunter-gatherers an entire lifetime to consider became something a mounted wagon-supported population could accomplish across a handful of generations, covering ground that earlier peoples would have considered the edge of the known world. And accomplish it they did on a scale almost nobody expected until the genetic evidence forced the issue. By the time researchers had assembled enough ancient genetic material to properly track what happened next, the numbers were almost hard to believe. Populations belonging to what archaeologists call the corded ware culture spread across a huge stretch of central, northern and eastern Europe, turned out to carry something nearing 79% of their genetic ancestry directly from these steppe herders. Not a touch of outside influence, not a modest contribution folded into an otherwise unchanged local population. Nearly 4/5 of an entire sprawling swathe of Europe's genetic identity replaced within a handful of centuries by people who had not so long before still been living as mobile herders on the open steppe far to the east. Can I be honest with you about how strange that number felt to me the first time I actually sat with it? We tend to imagine ancient population change as something slow, gradual, almost imperceptible, one small trickle of newcomers quietly blending in with a much larger existing population over many centuries. What the genetic record actually shows here looks considerably more like a flood than a trickle. Nowhere does that flood show up more dramatically than on a damp green island sitting at the very western edge of this entire migration, a place we now call Britain. For thousands of years before this, Britain had been home to Neolithic farming communities, the very people responsible for building the great stone monuments still standing there today, structures so massive and so carefully arranged that we still do not fully understand every detail of how they managed the engineering involved, let alone why they considered it worth the enormous effort. Then, sometime around 4,500 years ago, a new style of pottery began appearing across the island, distinctive bell-shaped drinking vessels alongside a wave of new burial customs, new metal tools and new styles of personal ornament. For a long while, archaeologists comfortably assumed this represented nothing more than a fashionable new idea spreading from the continent, the ancient equivalent of a popular trend catching on adopted enthusiastically by the very same people who were already living there, farming the very same fields their grandparents had farmed. The genetic evidence told an entirely different story. Comparing skeletons from before this cultural shift against skeletons from immediately after, researchers found that something close to 90% of the entire British gene pool had been replaced within a handful of generations. Not gradually diluted, not gently blended, overwhelmingly dramatically replaced. One of the archaeologists closely involved in interpreting this discovery admitted afterward with a kind of disarming honesty, "I deeply respect that not even the wildest theories floating around the field beforehand had prepared anyone for a number quite that large." Entire academic careers had been quietly built on the assumption that ancient Britain experienced gradual cultural influence rather than large-scale population turnover. The bones themselves simply did not agree. Here is where I think this story becomes truly useful for understanding something we touched on earlier tonight, rather than just a fascinating historical footnote on its own. Imagine you are a scientist looking only at a single gene, watching its frequency rise sharply across Britain within just a few generations right around this exact same window of time. Looked at in isolation without any wider context, that pattern could easily be mistaken for natural selection, acting with tremendous force, some trait suddenly proving so useful that it swept through an entire population in record time. But that is not actually what happened here at all. The gene did not become more common because it made anyone healthier, or helped them survive better, or gave them more children than their neighbours. It became more common because an entirely different group of people who already happened to carry it at high frequency arrived in large numbers and gradually became the majority of who was living on that island in the first place. The allele's frequency changed dramatically. The reason behind that change had nothing whatsoever to do with selection. Imagine for a moment two entirely different villages, each with a jar of 100 marbles, half of them blue and half of them red. In the first village over several generations, blue marbles slowly become more common because they happen to roll a little further, a little more reliably whenever children play with them, a small, repeated, genuine advantage patiently compounding year after year. In the second village, a wagon simply arrives one day carrying 90 new marbles, nearly all of them blue, and the people already living there quietly become a minority within their own jar overnight. Look only at the final count of blue marbles in either village without knowing anything else, and both jars can look identical. Only the story behind the numbers tells you which village experienced patient selection and which one simply got overwhelmed by newcomers. This is precisely the trap the more careful researchers we've already spent time with tonight built their entire methodology to avoid falling into. A sharp rise in frequency on its own tells you almost nothing about why that rise happened. Migration can produce exactly the same signature on a graph that real selection produces, and only by tracking a trait carefully across multiple, distinct populations, across multiple separate time periods, can you actually tell the two apart with any real confidence? Can I ask you something honestly, because I think it matters more than it might first appear to? How often do we in ordinary conversation casually assume that because something became common, it must have been chosen for some good reason? A popular opinion, a trending idea, a widely shared habit. We do this constantly well beyond genetics, quietly assuming popularity itself is evidence of merit. This step migration is in a strange way a quiet warning against that exact instinct. Sometimes something spreads widely, not because it earned its place, but simply because the people who already carried it happened to arrive somewhere first in large enough numbers at exactly the right moment in history. There is another thread woven into this same migration that historians and linguists had actually suspected long before any of the genetic evidence arrived to confirm it. The reach of this expansion did not stop comfortably at the edges of Europe. Related populations carrying this same steppe ancestry eventually turned up as far east as parts of Mongolia and as far south as the Indian subcontinent, an almost unbelievable span of territory for any single cultural wave to touch, let alone leave a lasting genetic fingerprint across. That geographic spread lines up remarkably closely with the distribution of an enormous family of languages, the one English itself happens to belong to, stretching from Ireland all the way to northern India, sharing deep buried grammatical bones beneath centuries of surface-level difference. Words for family members, for numbers, for basic elements of the natural world, quietly echo each other across languages separated today by thousands of miles, and a listener's complete inability to recognize any obvious connection at all. Whatever else was travelling alongside those wagons and horses 5,000 years ago, it seems increasingly likely that an early ancestor of the very language you are listening to this story in right now was quietly along for the ride as well. There is one more layer to this migration worth sitting with carefully, and I want to handle it honestly rather than glossing over it. Genetic material passed down specifically through the male line shows an especially dramatic pattern of replacement across many of these regions, in some places even more thorough than the overall genetic picture would suggest on its own, with certain paternal lineages common in these regions, before the migration becoming exceedingly rare or vanishing from the record entirely within just a handful of generations. Researchers are still working through exactly what that pattern tells us about how this particular migration actually unfolded on the ground, generation by generation, family by family, and I think it would be dishonest of me to pretend there is a single tidy, universally agreed explanation sitting ready and waiting. What we can say with real confidence is that this was not a gentle, evenly balanced meeting of two populations arriving as equals. It was something considerably more lopsided and considerably more complicated than the word migration alone quite manages to capture. I find myself thinking honestly about identity every time I sit with this particular chapter of the story. So many of us carry a quiet, comforting assumption that our ancestors have simply always belonged to wherever we happen to call home today, an unbroken line stretching back into the deep past without interruption, generation quietly handing the torch to generation in the exact same valley, the exact same coastline forever. The genetic record tells a messier, more honest story almost everywhere researchers have thought to look closely enough. Populations arrive, populations get overwhelmed, absorbed, or quietly replaced by other populations, and the people living in any given place today are very rarely the simple, uninterrupted continuation of whoever happened to be standing there first. There is something almost freeing in that once the initial surprise wears off. Nobody's ancestry is quite as pure, quite as singular, or quite as unbroken as national myths and family stories sometimes like to suggest. We are all, every single one of us, standing on top of layer after layer of arrival mixture and quiet replacement, whether our own family history happens to remember it or not. Where do you think your own ancestors were 5,000 years ago before whatever migration, invasion, or quiet mixing eventually shaped the family line that led to you sitting here tonight wrapped in a blanket, listening to a stranger's voice tell you a story about your own bones? It is a strange thing to sit with in the dark, isn't it? How much history had to happen messily, unpredictably, and entirely without anyone's permission, just for you to exist at all, exactly as you are right now. There is a small, almost comforting irony buried inside all this too, if you let yourself see it. Every population that ever showed up somewhere new, convinced they were the ones finally settling the land for good, eventually became the very same kind of ancient layer that some future migration would one day sweep across, absorb, and quietly move beyond. Nobody gets to be the final chapter. Everybody eventually becomes somebody else's foundation. But population and identity were never the only things this enormous wave of migration rewrote as it moved across the continent. It carried something considerably more visible along with it too, something written directly onto the surface of the body itself, quietly reshaping what an entire continent of people would eventually come to look like. Let's start with a photograph that does not actually exist because the person in it died roughly 10,000 years before anyone had invented a camera. And yet, thanks to a small fragment of bone, we can describe his face with more confidence than you might expect. In 1900, 3 workers improving drainage inside a cave in the English countryside, a place called Cheddar Gorge, uncovered a nearly complete human skeleton buried alone rather than alongside others, the way most burials from that era tend to appear tucked into the sediment for roughly 10,000 years undisturbed the entire time. For more than a century, this particular skeleton, nicknamed Cheddar Man, sat in a museum case with an artist's best guess, standing in for his actual appearance, a guess that, like most guesses of that era, imagined a pale-skinned, unmistakably European-looking face, because that is simply what everyone quietly assumed a person native to that part of the world must have looked like going back to the very beginning. In 2018, researchers finally extracted usable genetic material directly from his skull and gave that old assumption a proper evidence-based test. He turned out to have striking blue eyes and skin that was, in the researcher's own careful phrasing, dark to black. Can you sit with that combination for a moment, because I think it deserves more than a quick nod before we move on. Not a light tan, not some vague, ambiguous in-between shade history books love to imagine when they cannot quite bring themselves to say anything definite. Dark skin alongside strikingly pale, light-coloured eyes on a man whose ancestors had already been living in what we now call Britain for thousands of years by the time he was born. And he was not some rare isolated exception either. Every other well-preserved hunter-gatherer skeleton from this same broad window of European history, tested using the same careful methods, tells a remarkably similar story. Dark skin paired surprisingly often with light-coloured eyes scattered from Spain to Hungary to Luxembourg across an entire continent's worth of deep ancestry. I think most of us grew up with a quiet, unspoken assumption that pale skin has simply always belonged to Europe, an ancient, practically permanent fixture stretching back tens of thousands of years without interruption. The genetic evidence tells us that assumption is quite simply backward. Pale eyes appear to have shown up first, long before pale skin ever did. Pale skin itself did not become common until considerably later, arriving largely alongside farming, spreading through many of the very same migrations we've already spent time with tonight. Even blonde hair, something else many of us instinctively picture as ancient and unchanging, followed a broadly similar pattern, largely absent from the very earliest hunter-gatherer populations tested, and only becoming widespread considerably later. It is worth pausing here to notice how thoroughly this rearranges the tidy mental picture most of us carry around without ever examining it closely. We tend to imagine physical traits arriving as a match set: dark eyes with dark skin, pale eyes with pale skin, as though nature assembled each population from one single coordinated colour palette. Actual history looked far messier than that. Individual traits arriving on their own separate timelines, mixing and recombining in combinations that would look almost unfamiliar to us today, worn casually by people who had absolutely no concept that any of it would eventually seem surprising to their distant descendants. So here is a fair question worth sitting with honestly. If pale skin was not always the obvious inevitable outcome for people living in a cloudy, low sunlight part of the world, what actually pushed it to spread so widely eventually once it did begin appearing? The leading explanation involves a nutrient most of us only think about when a doctor mentions our blood test results: vitamin D. Skin naturally produces this particular vitamin when sunlight reaches it directly, and darker skin quite effectively blocks a considerable portion of that sunlight from getting through, an enormous practical advantage in a place with year-round strong sun, protecting against sun damage the same skin tone would otherwise struggle with daily, and a real liability somewhere considerably darker and cloudier for much of the year, where that same protection simply blocks light the body actually needs. Lighter skin lets more of that limited northern sunlight through, helping the body manufacture enough of this vitamin to keep bones strong and healthy, avoiding painful weakening conditions that could seriously cripple a person over a long enough winter. But here is the detail that makes Cheddar Man's own story make considerably more sense once you actually think it through properly. Hunter-gatherers living along the coastlines and rivers of ancient Europe ate enormous quantities of fish, shellfish, and organ meat foods naturally rich in exactly the vitamin their skin was otherwise struggling to produce enough of on its own. Their diet was quietly doing the job their skin tone had not yet caught up to handling. It was only once farming spread widely, and diets shifted heavily toward grain with considerably less fish and organ meat on the table, that pale skin actually became a meaningfully bigger advantage, and only then did it begin spreading rapidly through the population. Diet, in other words, appears to have been quietly propping up dark-skinned hunter-gatherers for thousands of years longer than most of us ever imagined, right up until the moment their own descendants changed what they ate for dinner. I do want to be fair and mention honestly that vitamin D is not the only explanation scientists have seriously proposed here. A separate line of thinking suggests that visible traits like skin tone, hair colour and eye colour may have spread partly because people found them attractive in a potential partner, an entirely different kind of pressure working alongside survival, rather than replacing it. Nobody has definitively settled which force mattered more, and honestly I suspect the truthful answer involves some tangled combination of both working together in ways we may never fully untangle with complete confidence. Skin and eyes were never the only visible traits quietly being rewritten during this same broad window of history either. Take red hair, something you've very likely met in person at some point, whether or not you happen to carry it yourself. Fewer than 2 out of every 100 people worldwide have naturally red hair, yet in Scotland that number climbs to somewhere near 13 out of every 101 of the highest concentrations found anywhere on the entire planet, with a considerably larger share of the population quietly carrying the gene without ever showing the trait themselves. The gene responsible sits inside a receptor that normally tells skin cells to produce a dark protective pigment. When that receptor stops working properly, the body switches over to a lighter reddish pigment, instead one that offers noticeably less protection from the sun, but which in a place with famously little sun to protect against in the first place, apparently was not much of a trade-off worth worrying over. Interestingly, that same receptor appears to influence more than simple colouring too, with some research suggesting it plays a quiet role in how strongly a person feels certain types of pain, a small strange reminder that a single gene rarely does just one tidy job and nothing else. And here is a small detail I find almost delightful, honestly tucked away in a study most people outside genetics have never heard of. Researchers who sequenced fragments of this exact same gene directly from actual Neanderthal remains found something unexpected sitting inside it, a mutation different from the one responsible for red hair in humans today, but strikingly similar in what it actually did quietly, disrupting the very same pigment-producing switch. 2 entirely separate species evolving independently apparently stumbled onto strikingly similar solutions to roughly the same problem, using the very same stretch of genetic code to get there. It is worth being careful here because this does not mean modern redheads inherited their hair colour directly from Neanderthals. It means something almost stranger that 2 different branches of the human family tree facing a broadly similar environment separately discovered nearly the same trick entirely on their own. Can I ask you something honestly before we keep going? Do you know your own hair colour's history in your family, whether it goes back generations or seem to appear from nowhere? In you specifically surprising everyone at the hospital, a grandmother's colouring quietly skipping a whole generation before resurfacing again. I have always found those stories oddly moving, a small visible echo of some ancestor from centuries back, quietly resurfacing in a face nobody expected it in. Not every visible trait scientists have tracked through this same window of history has a tidy explanation attached to it yet, and I think it is worth being honest about that too, rather than pretending every mystery has already been solved. Blood type offers a good example. Researchers studying the same enormous stretch of genetic data we've discussed already tonight found that one particular blood type steadily grew more common over the past 6,000 years, while another slowly declined across that exact same window, a clear, measurable, statistically confident pattern sitting right there in the data. Nobody currently has a fully satisfying explanation for why. It may be tied to resistance against disease nobody has properly identified yet. It may be tied to something else entirely still waiting to be discovered by a researcher who has not been born yet. For now, it simply sits there, a confirmed pattern, with no settled story attached to it. A reminder that even the most rigorous science regularly produces answers that raise more questions than they close. And then there is a finding I suspect a fair number of people listening tonight will find a little too relatable for comfort. A genetic variant associated with keeping a full head of hair well into later life has been quietly declining in frequency for roughly the last 7,000 years. Not increasing, declining. Which means, as strange as this sounds, male pattern. Baldness has been slowly, patiently becoming more common across the very same stretch of history we have spent this whole video exploring rather than less. I will admit when I first came across that particular detail I laughed out loud, honestly sitting alone at my desk. Somewhere out there is a man quietly blaming bad luck or stress, or simply getting older for a hairline that has actually been retreating ever so slightly for 7,000 years, running generation after generation completely unrelated to anything he personally did wrong. Here is what I think ties all of these visible traits together if I try to step back and look at the whole pattern honestly. These are in a real sense the shallowest layer of everything we've discussed tonight. The most recent coat of paint applied to a structure whose real architecture was built by forces considerably older and considerably less visible: diet, disease, migration, survival. And yet these are almost always the traits we notice first about each other, the traits entire cultures build elaborate stories and assumptions around, sometimes with real consequences attached. Despite being evolutionarily speaking some of the newest, least settled, most recently rewritten details in the entire human genome, there is something worth sitting with in that imbalance, honestly. We spend an enormous amount of energy as a species sorting each other by the newest, most superficial layer of paint, while the far older, far more consequential architecture underneath the immune adjustments, the dietary trade-offs, the deep migrations reshaping entire populations sits almost entirely invisible, doing considerably more to shape who actually survives and thrives than any colour ever managed to on its own. Skin, hair, eyes, blood type, even a receding hairline, they tell a story certainly, but it is worth remembering they are rarely the deepest story sitting underneath any of us. There is a very different kind of story still waiting, though one written not on the surface of the body at all, but buried considerably deeper inside the very risk of certain diseases that still quietly follow some of us today, forged not by sunlight or attraction, but by something considerably darker, catastrophe itself sweeping through entire populations and leaving a genetic scar behind that some of us are quite literally still carrying inside us tonight. Between the years 1347 and 1351, a disease swept across Europe, Asia and parts of Africa that killed somewhere between 30 and 50 out of every 100 people it touched. Historians still call it the single deadliest event ever recorded in human history, a claim that becomes almost impossible to fully hold in your mind once you actually sit with the scale of it. Entire towns emptied out within weeks. Family lines, some of them centuries old, simply ended all at once, with nobody left standing to remember exactly how they had once continued. Ships arrived in harbour with entire crews already dead at the oars. Priests ran out of prayers to offer, and grave diggers ran out of ground to dig fast enough. Most of us know this disaster by its popular name, the Black Death. For centuries afterward, people naturally wondered why some individuals seemed to survive encounters with the disease, while their neighbours, sometimes sleeping in the very same room, breathing the very same air, did not. For most of that time, the honest answer was simply that nobody could say not, with any real confidence beyond appeals to luck or prayer, or whatever local remedy happened to be fashionable that particular decade. Then a few years ago, a team of researchers finally found a way to ask the bones themselves, working across burial sites in London and in Denmark, researchers carefully gathered genetic material from more than 200 individuals, sorted deliberately into 3 separate groups. People who died shortly before the plague ever arrived, people who died during the outbreak itself buried hastily in mass plague pits, still visible to archaeologists today, and people who lived on afterward, surviving into the years that followed. The idea was elegantly simple on paper, even if the actual laboratory work behind it took years of careful effort. If a particular genetic variant helped someone survive infection, it should show up more often among the people who made it through than among those who did not. When the results came back in 2022, published in one of the most respected scientific journals in the world, one gene in particular stood out sharply from the rest, a gene involved in helping immune cells recognize dangerous invaders circulating inside the body. According to that initial study, individuals carrying a certain protective version of this gene were reported to be around 40% more likely to survive the plague than those without it. A striking number one that made headlines across the world almost overnight, quoted breathlessly in newspapers that rarely cover genetics at all. And there was a genuine sting hidden in the tail of that same discovery too. That very same protective version of the gene, the researchers noted, is also linked today to a heightened risk of certain modern autoimmune conditions, including a painful chronic digestive illness that affects a meaningful number of people quietly living with it right now tonight, completely unaware their body's ancient defense system might be quietly working against them in a different way centuries later. It is a beautifully tidy story, honestly. Catastrophe strikes. A trait proves life-saving in the moment. That same trait, centuries removed from the crisis that shaped it, becomes a burden instead. I understand completely why this particular finding travelled as far and as fast as it did. But here is where I think tonight's story needs to slow down and take a breath, because the real complete picture turned out to be considerably more complicated than the headlines allowed for. Not long after that first study was published in one of the very same research groups we have already spent considerable time with tonight, a separate team of scientists went back and tested those exact same claims again, this time with a noticeably stricter, more skeptical set of statistical tools, the kind designed specifically to catch a researcher accidentally fooling themselves. And what they found was sobering. Once they reran the numbers, properly correcting for the sheer number of individual comparisons being made across the genome, something every careful study of this kind absolutely has to account for, and accounting honestly for the kind of chemical damage that naturally accumulates inside genetic material buried in the ground for 6 centuries. The dramatic signal that had made headlines everywhere largely disappeared. What had originally looked like clear, confident evidence of a life-saving mutation now looked considerably more plausibly like an artifact of the process itself, ancient bone slowly decaying in ways that can quietly imitate a pattern of real biological selection if you're not careful enough while searching for one. Notice something here too, because I think it matters. This was not some outside skeptic with a grudge eager to tear down an exciting finding purely for the sake of it. This correction came from within the very same broader scientific community researchers who understood exactly how difficult and valuable the original attempt had been, and who cared enough about getting the story right to spend their own time checking it properly, rather than simply accepting a satisfying headline and moving on. Can I be honest with you about how I feel telling you this part of the story? I actually find it more meaningful than the original headline, not less. A famous claim published in one of the most respected scientific journals in the entire world, carried by news outlets everywhere within days, was calmly, patiently, and rigorously checked by other scientists willing to do the far less glamorous work of testing it properly, and adjusted honestly once the numbers did not hold up, the way everyone initially hoped they would. That is not science failing. That is science working exactly the way it is supposed to, even when the correction is considerably less exciting than the original headline ever was. Here is a question worth sitting with honestly before we move forward tonight. How many stories do you think you have personally accepted as settled fact simply because the first version you happened to hear sounded confident, dramatic, and satisfying, without ever quite circling back to check whether anyone had properly tested it since? I know I have done this more times than I would like to admit, and I suspect if we are both being honest with each other in the dark right now, you probably have too. The good news is that this particular chapter of history is not actually a dead end even after that correction. A separate, more thoroughly tested body of research drawing on genetic material spanning that same broad historical period has consistently found something closely related, a real well-supported pattern worth sitting with carefully. As populations across Europe grew larger, more crowded and more thoroughly connected by trade and travel, throughout the centuries following the Roman era and continuing through the medieval period, researchers have found clear evidence of selection, favouring genetic variants tied to a more aggressive inflammatory immune response, the kind of biological reaction responsible for the fever swelling and general misery you feel when your body is actively fighting something off. In a world thick with recurring infectious disease, a body quicker to sound the alarm and mount an aggressive defense had a real measurable survival advantage, catching threats earlier, fighting them harder before they had a chance to spread and turn lethal, the biological equivalent of a smoke detector calibrated to go off at the very first hint of smoke, rather than waiting patiently until the whole room was already on fire. Here is the difficult, quietly uncomfortable part of that same story, though. Those very same genetic variants, the ones that once made an immune system faster and fiercer against infection, are the same ones researchers have linked today to an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, the kind of slow, silent damage to blood vessels and the heart that builds up quietly over decades, eventually contributing to heart attacks and strokes later in life. Inflammation, it turns out, does not politely confine itself to fighting off the specific intruder it was called up to deal with. Left running for years without a clear enemy to actually direct itself against it, can quietly begin damaging the soft, delicate lining of blood vessels instead, the same walls responsible for carrying blood safely to and from your heart every single day of your life. Think about what that actually means for a moment, because I think it deserves more than a passing nod. An immune system tuned toward constant heightened readiness made excellent sense for someone who might realistically face a serious, potentially lethal infection every single year of their life, and who statistically might not survive much past their 30s or 40s in the first place. That same heightened readiness, running quietly in the background for an entire modern lifetime that might stretch 70, 80 or more years without anywhere near the same relentless infectious threat to actually justify. It does not simply switch itself off once it is no longer needed. It keeps running exactly as instructed, generating a slow cumulative kind of wear and tear on the very blood vessels responsible for keeping you alive decade after decade, largely unnoticed, until the day it very much is noticed. I think this might be one of the most quietly important ideas in tonight's entire story, honestly, so let me say it plainly. Evolution was never optimizing your body for a long, comfortable life stretching into your 80s. It was optimizing you for surviving long enough to have children and to help raise them past their most vulnerable years inside a world where dying young from infection was simply an ordinary expected part of being alive. Modern medicine, modern sanitation, and modern nutrition have handed us all an extra several decades that biology itself was never specifically designed to plan for. Some of what we now quietly suffer through in our 60s and 70s honestly is not a flaw in the design. It is simply the design running well past the warranty it was originally built for in a world it never expected any of us to actually reach. I find that thought almost funny in a dark sort of way if I let myself sit with it long enough. Your immune system was never handed a user's manual with the suggested lifespan printed neatly on the cover. It was simply told in the bluntest possible biological terms, survive whatever shows up and figure the rest out later. Nobody thought to mention that later might eventually stretch on for another 40 or 50 years, past the point anyone actually expected you to still be standing there waiting for it to catch up. Do you know anyone in your own life managing heart disease or high blood pressure or some other slow, quiet condition tied to inflammation? Someone who has spent years being told simply to eat better and move more, as though willpower alone could fully undo something with roots running this deep. There is a real possibility that what they are living with today is not entirely bad luck, or even entirely a matter of diet and exercise alone, but is partly the echo of a defense system built for a world where the greater danger was never quite living long enough to need to worry about it. There is a strange, almost tender kind of grace in that thought if you let it sit with you for a moment. Your body is not broken. It is simply still running instructions written for ancestors who faced an entirely different set of dangers than the ones you actually face tonight, doing its very best with a rulebook nobody has fully updated in thousands of years. And here is something worth remembering before we move any further tonight too. Every single story we've explored so far, the farming, the gluten, the immune rewiring, the migration, the pale skin, even this quiet, difficult trade-off tied to plague and inflammation has largely unfolded across one single sprawling stretch of the world Europe and the lands immediately surrounding it. But evolution was never confined to one continent patiently waiting for Europe to finish its own story before starting anywhere else. All across the rest of the globe, entirely separate populations were running their own extraordinary experiments at exactly the same time, facing challenges considerably stranger, in some cases, than anything we have covered tonight so far. Let's start on a plateau roughly 4 kilometers above sea level, cold enough most mornings to see your own breath thin enough that a visitor stepping off a plane there for the first time can truly struggle just walking up a short flight of stairs without stopping to catch their breath halfway, heart pounding, head aching in a way that can truly frighten someone unprepared for it. People have lived on the Tibetan plateau for thousands of years, and their bodies handle that thin air in a way that still quietly surprises visiting doctors and researchers. Most of us dropped into that same environment would respond the way our bodies have always responded to low oxygen, by producing considerably more hemoglobin, the molecule responsible for carrying oxygen through the blood. In the short term that helps. Stay at altitude long enough though, and all the extra hemoglobin starts thickening the blood dangerously, raising real risks for the heart and for pregnant women in particular, a serious danger to both mother and child, one that has historically made pregnancy at extreme altitude a real and fraught experience for newcomers to the region. Tibetans remarkably mostly skip that entire dangerous overcorrection. Their bodies stay calm, producing only a modest measured increase in hemoglobin, rather than flooding the bloodstream with it, and somehow that gentler, more restrained response works out considerably better for them in the long run. When researchers finally traced the specific piece of genetic code responsible for this unusual restrained response, the trail led somewhere nobody expected at all. That particular stretch of code turned out to match almost precisely a piece of genetic material belonging to an entirely different long-extinct branch of the human family. The very same one we met earlier tonight, first identified from nothing more than a single overlooked finger bone sitting quietly inside a cave in Siberia. Somewhere along the way, thousands of years ago, an ancestor of today's Tibetans appears to have inherited this particular gift directly from that extinct relative, a small borrowed piece of someone else's evolutionary homework quietly solving a problem the borrower had not even encountered yet. Can I ask you to sit with that connection for just a second, because I find it almost unbearably moving? An entire population living comfortably today at an altitude that would leave most of the rest of us gasping owes at least part of that comfort to a species that vanished from the Earth tens of thousands of years ago, discovered by science from nothing more than a single finger bone. Extinction. It turns out was never quite as final as the word itself likes to suggest. Something of that vanished branch of the human family is still quite literally breathing easily on a mountainside tonight, doing the very thing its original owners were never given the chance to keep doing for themselves. Travel to an entirely different high-altitude region, the Andes Mountains of South America, and you find people who have also thoroughly mastered life at extreme elevation, for roughly as long as Tibetans have communities scattered across peaks and high plateaus stretching through what is now Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. But they solved the exact same problem in a completely different way. Rather than restraining hemoglobin production, the way Tibetans do, Andean populations lean into producing considerably more of it, keeping their blood extremely efficient at carrying oxygen, despite the disadvantage their bodies essentially betting on abundance rather than restraint. Two populations facing the exact same hostile environment, separated by an entire ocean and thousands of years of independent history, arrived at two almost opposite biological strategies, and both remarkably work. I think there is something worth sitting with in that particular pairing, honestly. We tend to assume quietly that there is always one single correct answer waiting to be discovered for any given problem. One best solution nature eventually settles on, the way a textbook likes to present a single tidy formula at the end of a chapter. Altitude adaptation quietly proves that assumption wrong. Sometimes there is more than one door leading out of the same room, and different populations working entirely independently will happily find completely different ones arriving at the same destination from two directions nobody would have predicted lined up at all. Come down from the mountains now all the way to sea level, to a scattering of houseboats drifting through the shallow waters between the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia. The Bahau people have spent centuries living almost entirely at sea, diving for their food without any equipment at all, sometimes staying beneath the surface for as long as 13 minutes at a time, descending to depths that would leave most trained recreational divers uneasy, even with a full tank of air strapped to their back. Children grow up learning to dive the way children elsewhere learn to ride a bicycle, an ordinary skill. Nobody in the community considers remarkable simply the way life at sea happens to work. Researchers who studied the Bajau found something remarkable. Sitting inside their bodies, spleens roughly 50% larger on average than those of their closest non-diving neighbours, living just across the water on the mainland. A genetic difference not simply the product of a lifetime spent underwater, since even Bajau, who rarely dive themselves, still carry the same enlarged organ. The spleen, it turns out, quietly stores a reserve supply of oxygen, rich blood cells, and contracts on cue during a deep dive, releasing that reserve directly into circulation exactly when the body needs it most. A larger spleen means a larger reserve tank hidden inside the body, evolved specifically for people whose entire livelihood depends on holding their breath considerably longer than the rest of us ever will. Somewhere out on that water right now tonight, someone is diving on a single breath, using a biological advantage quietly written into their body by ancestors who spent centuries proving one dive at a time that the trait was worth passing forward, an inheritance considerably stranger and considerably more useful than any family heirloom sitting in a drawer somewhere. Head north instead, all the way to the Arctic coastline of Greenland, and you find an entirely different kind of dietary story than the one we spent time with earlier tonight. This one built almost entirely around fat rather than grain or dairy. The traditional Inuit diet leans heavily on seal whale and other marine mammals, food extraordinarily rich in a particular category of fat. Most nutritionists today spend considerable energy encouraging the rest of us to eat more of. By ordinary nutritional logic, a diet built this heavily around fat should carry serious consequences for heart health. Genetic material recovered from Greenlandic Inuit populations shows clear, strong selection, acting on a cluster of genes responsible for processing exactly that kind of fat changes that appear to date back at least 20,000 years, likely tracing all the way back to ancestors who crossed from Siberia. Those same genetic changes come with a fascinating side effect too: measurably shorter average height, roughly 2 centimeters less on average, alongside changes in body weight, a reminder that a single genetic adjustment rarely arrives with only one tidy consequence attached to it. Adjust one dial deep inside the body's chemistry, and several other dials seemingly unrelated at first glance quietly shift right along with it, and finally back across the ocean to a completely different kind of threat altogether, one carried not by cold or altitude but by something considerably smaller, a mosquito. Across broad stretches of West and Central Africa, one particular genetic variant sits at almost universal frequency. Today found in nearly everyone tested in some regions, one of the most complete genetic sweeps recorded anywhere on the planet. That variant quietly removes a specific docking point normally sitting on the surface of red blood cells, a docking point 1. Especially common species of malaria parasite depends on almost entirely to force its way inside. Remove the docking point and that particular parasite for the most part simply cannot get in the biological equivalent of removing every doorknob from a building and leaving the intruder standing helplessly outside, unable to find a way through, despite pressing against every wall available. Researchers studying the strength of this particular piece of natural selection have called it one of the most powerfully selected traits found anywhere in the entire human genome, a defense so effective and so overwhelmingly favored that it swept through an enormous portion of an entire continent, likely within a remarkably short span of generations once it first appeared. Interestingly, and in keeping with the spirit of intellectual honesty, we have tried to hold on to throughout tonight's whole story. More recent research has found rare exceptions to this protection cases, where the malaria parasite appears to be slowly finding alternate ways in despite the missing docking point. Even a defense this powerful, sculpted by thousands of years of relentless pressure, is not necessarily the final word. The arms race, it seems, rarely declares a permanent winner on either side. Here is what strikes me most honestly looking at all 4 of these stories side by side: mountains, ocean ice, and mosquito. Every single one of them tells us the exact same underlying truth, just wearing a completely different costume, depending on where in the world you happen to be standing. Evolution was never something that happened primarily to one group of people in one particular region, while everyone else simply waited their turn watching from the sidelines. It was happening everywhere all at once, endlessly creative, endlessly specific to whatever particular challenge a given landscape happened to throw at the people living inside it, from a mountain plateau to a coral reef to a frozen coastline to a mosquito-ridden river delta. Can I ask you something honestly before we move toward the end of tonight's story? Where does your own family come from, and what particular challenge might that specific patch of earth have quietly handed down to the people who came before you, written somewhere inside your own body right now, waiting patiently for a story like this one to finally point it out to you? A tolerance for a certain food, a resistance to a certain illness, a body shaped in some small quiet way by mountains or coastlines or diseases you yourself have never once had to face directly. I think this is one of the most important ideas we have touched tonight, so let me say it as plainly as I can. There has never been a single standard version of humanity quietly perfected somewhere that everyone else was simply working their way toward eventually. There have only ever been thousands of separate ongoing conversations between particular people and the particular ground beneath their feet, each one producing its own small brilliant solution, none of them more finished, or more correct, or more evolved than any of the others. A body built to dive is not a lesser version of a body built to climb a mountain. A body built to metabolize whale fat is not an earlier draft of a body built to metabolize wheat. They are simply different, equally valid answers written by different landscapes, asking different questions of the people living inside them. Every story we have covered tonight so far, wherever in the world it happened to unfold, shares one final thread running quietly underneath all of it, and it brings us right back to the very question that started this entire journey in the first place. If all of this happened continuously in every single corner of the globe for the last 10,000 years, without ever once slowing down, quietly rewriting, mountain dwellers and sea nomads and mosquito-battling farmers alike, what does that actually tell us about right now, about tonight? About the particular moment you happen to be lying in as you listen to this? Because if evolution never once paused for any of the people we've met so far tonight, there is no reasonable version of this story where it decided to pause specifically for you. Here is the honest answer to that question, and I think it might be the most important one we save for last tonight on purpose. Yes, you're still evolving. Right now tonight, lying there in the dark, listening to my voice, your own body quietly running the same ancient process, every single ancestor we have discussed tonight was also, without ever knowing it, running underneath their own ordinary, unremarkable days. I know how that sounds almost too strange to sit comfortably in your mind. Evolution has always felt to most of us like something that happened past tense, safely finished, tucked away in museums and textbooks alongside dinosaurs and cave paintings. Something that belongs to a much older, much slower version of the world than the one any of us actually wake up inside every morning. But a handful of researchers only a few years ago finally found a way to actually test that quiet assumption properly, rather than simply repeating it because it sounded reasonable the way so many comfortable assumptions managed to survive simply by never being questioned closely enough. They gathered genetic information from roughly 60,000 people of European background living in California and from another 150,000 people living across Britain, part of an enormous ongoing medical research effort originally built to help doctors understand disease not to settle a centuries-old argument about evolution at all. And then they did something almost deceptively simple. They compared genetic variants carried by people who lived long lives against variants carried by people who did not, looking closely at parents' recorded lifespans as a kind of stand-in for survival itself, since most of the participants themselves were still very much alive and had not yet had the chance to prove anything about their own longevity one way or the other. If evolution had truly stopped the way so many of us were casually taught to believe, this comparison should have turned up nothing at all, just random noise, no real pattern hiding anywhere inside it, no matter how carefully anyone went looking. That is not what they found. Certain genetic variants, subtle ones, nothing dramatic or headline-grabbing on their own, showed up measurably more often among people who lived longer and among people connected to higher fertility than you would expect from chance alone. The signal was faint. The researchers themselves were quick to say so honestly, nothing like the dramatic sweeping changes we spent tonight tracing across 10,000 years of farming, migration and plague. but faint is not the same thing as absent. One of the scientists behind that particular study put it, plainly admitting it was a subtle signal, but a real one, genuine evidence that natural selection is still quietly operating inside modern human populations, right now, in your own lifetime, possibly inside your own body, this very night, adjusting something so small, neither you nor anyone you know will ever consciously notice it happening. Think about the scale of what that actually means for a moment. Not thousands of years, not even hundreds. A single generation, maybe two, was enough for careful researchers to catch this ancient patient process, still quietly at work hiding in plain sight, inside data originally collected for entirely different medical reasons. And here is a detail I find almost unbearably satisfying: a small circle quietly closing itself before our very eyes tonight. That same enormous pool of information gathered from ordinary volunteers across Britain, simply trying to help modern medicine understand disease a little better, is the very same resource researchers eventually turn to when building the massive 10,000-year study of ancient skeletons we open tonight's entire story with. The living and the dead, in a very real sense, ended up sitting side by side in the very same dataset, each one quietly confirming what the other had already started to suggest, one speaking through modern blood samples, the other through bone dust drilled from a skull 9,000 years old. Evolution never stopped. It simply got harder to see without exactly the right tools and exactly the right patience to look properly. So if evolution never actually paused even for a moment, what happens next? Where does all of this go from here? Here is where I want to be careful with you, because this next part is not settled science, the way almost everything else we discussed tonight has been. It is an open question, honestly open, with thoughtful people, arguing sincerely on more than one side of it. For the very first time in the entire history of our species, humans now possess tools capable of directly reading, and in some limited cases directly editing the genetic code itself, rather than simply waiting patiently for chance mutations and slow selection to do the work across thousands of years the way every single story we told tonight unfolded. Parents can already screen embryos for certain serious genetic conditions before a pregnancy even begins, a choice that would have sounded like pure fantasy to every single person we met earlier tonight, from a Neolithic farmer to a Bronze Age herder to a survivor of the Black Death. Laboratories around the world are actively experimenting with tools precise enough to correct specific genetic errors, directly tools that may one day treat or even prevent diseases that have quietly shaped our species for as long as we have existed, including, perhaps someday, some of the very trade-offs we spent tonight carefully unpacking together. Some people look at that possibility and feel something close to hope. An old and stubborn enemy, sickness and suffering passed down blindly through families for generations, finally within reach of a real, deliberate answer, rather than simply being left to chance the way it always has been before now. Parents who have watched a child struggle with a condition they themselves unknowingly passed down understandably see enormous promise in a future where that particular kind of suffering becomes optional rather than inevitable. Other people, including plenty of thoughtful scientists and ethicists who study this closely for a living, feel something closer to real unease, and I think their concerns deserve to be taken just as seriously as the hope does. Evolution left alone has always worked, slowly testing changes patiently across countless generations, quietly discarding whatever does not actually work in practice, long before it could cause serious widespread harm. Deliberately editing our own genetic code moves at an entirely different speed and carries an entirely different kind of risk. The risk of confidently changing something today, only for its consequences to reveal themselves clearly 2 or 3 generations from now when reversing the choice is no longer simple, or possibly not even possible anymore. There are also real difficult questions about access and fairness, about whether powerful new tools like these end up helping everyone equally, or mostly benefiting whoever can already afford them, quietly opening a new kind of gap between families with resources and families without. I am not going to pretend I know exactly how that particular tension resolves, and honestly I do not think anyone fully does yet either, no matter how confidently certain voices online might claim otherwise. What I can tell you is that the conversation itself is proof of something rather beautiful if you sit with it for a moment. For the first time since our species first stood upright, we are not simply subject to this process anymore, passively carried along wherever it happens to take us. We're in some limited, still uncertain way becoming active participants inside a story that has been writing itself around us for hundreds of thousands of years, without ever once asking our permission. I want to take you back just for a moment before we bring tonight's story to a rest all the way to where we began. Do you remember her, the farmer somewhere in ancient Anatolia, 9,000 years ago, grinding wheat by hand in the cold morning light, pausing at her doorway to look up at a sky full of stars with absolutely no idea that a piece of bone behind her ear would someday travel across an ocean into a laboratory in Massachusetts and help an entire generation of scientists finally prove that her species, our species, never actually stopped changing at all? She could not have known any of what we now know about her. She could not have known her body was quietly running an experiment that would not show results for 9,000 years. She could not have known that centuries after her death, an entire field of science would be built specifically to listen to what her bones had been trying to say the whole time. And yet here we are tonight, still listening, still carrying forward small quiet pieces of whatever she and thousands of others like her passed down without ever meaning to, without ever knowing they were doing it at all. She was never simply a fact buried quietly in the past, waiting patiently to be discovered. She was and still is one small, unfinished sentence inside a story that includes every single person who has ever lived, every person alive on this earth tonight, and every person who has not been born yet. You did not arrive at the end of that story. None of us did. There is no ending printed anywhere in your genetic code, no final chapter, quietly waiting to shut the book. There is only the next line being written right now, tonight in you, whether you happen to notice it happening or not. I hope if nothing else stays with you after tonight, it is this. You are not a finished product. You never were. You are a living, breathing, still unfolding sentence in the longest story ever told, one that started long before you, and one that will continue long after you, carried forward by people who have not been born yet, shaped by choices and circumstances none of us can fully predict from here. Every trait we talked about tonight, the ones that helped, the ones that quietly cost something too, the ones still being tested even now, arrived the exact same way, patiently, invisibly, one ordinary life at a time, carried by people who are simply trying to survive their own particular Tuesday, with absolutely no idea they were writing a chapter someone like you would eventually hear about, thousands of years later in the dark, wrapped in a blanket on an entirely different continent than the one their own feet ever touched. That is what you are part of now too. Not a spectator reading someone else's finished history. A participant quietly adding your own unread line to the very same unfinished page. Thank you truly for spending these quiet hours with me tonight, for letting an old farmer, a stubborn scientist chasing mummies in secret, a plague, a mountain, and an ocean full of quiet divers all find their way into the same dark, comfortable room where you happen to be resting right now. Stories like this one only really work because someone on the other end is actually listening closely, patiently, the way you just did all the way to the very last word, If any part of tonight's story stayed with you, I would love to know which one whenever you have the time and the daylight to tell me. And if you found your way here tonight without having spent time with any of the earlier stories on this channel, there is a whole quiet library of them waiting for you whenever sleep decides it can wait just a little longer. Shut your eyes now if you have not already. Let the evidence settle quietly the way everything else in this story eventually did given enough time, and when you are ready to return for another night like this one, I will be right here waiting with another quiet corner of history to share with you another story worth staying up just a little later for. Sleep well.